In the winter of 1408, the cold came for England like a slow and patient thief, and it did not leave for 3 long months. The chroniclers of the age wrote it down almost in disbelief. From the dark days of December to the first soft thaw of March, snow lay heaped against the doors, the rivers hardened into roads, and the great River Thames froze so solidly that people strolled across it, where boats had drifted only weeks before. Small birds, they wrote, dropped dead from the frozen hedgerows in their thousands, undone by hunger and a cold so deep it seemed to silence the very dawn. 2 years later, in 1410, another great frost seized the land for 14 unbroken weeks, and once again the wild ducks and geese died among the reeds. These were not the gentle, cosy winters of a Christmas card. These were the winters that quietly decided who would live to see the spring. And yet, and this is the thought I want you to carry into sleep tonight, ordinary people survived them, not kings in castles, not lords behind glass windows with servants to stack the fire. Ordinary people, peasants, families who lived in a single room of mud and timber and straw, with a cow breathing in the corner and a fire they were actually legally required to put out every single night. They had no thermometers to tell them how bad it truly was, which was probably a mercy. They simply pulled the world in close, banked their little fire down to a glow, and waited out the dark together. Tonight, we are going to join them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, no hard sell. If these slow journeys into the past help you drift off, that little tap tells me to keep making them, and then I get to keep talking to you in the dark like this. And while you're lying there, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from. Leave a comment with your town, your city, your country, and the local time as you press play. It is one of my favourite things, scrolling through and seeing one soul in a rainy northern city at midnight, another in a warm kitchen at dawn, all of us awake or nearly asleep in the very same quiet moment. Now dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft, steady hum in the background. Pull the blanket up to your chin, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Picture it. You're not quite yourself tonight. Tonight you are a villager in medieval England some 600 years ago, somewhere in the low green hills that the snow has turned to soft grey wool. The exact year hardly matters. Pick any winter in the 13 or 1400s, because for people like you, one bitter winter was much like another. You are what the record keepers call a villein, which is a fancy Latin-flavoured word for a peasant who belongs, more or less, to the local lord, along with the land you work. It is not a glamorous title. You will not be knighted. But you know things the lord does not, like exactly how to keep a family, a cow and a fire alive through the longest, coldest night of the year. The light is going now. In midwinter this far north the sun gives up embarrassingly early, gone by 4 in the afternoon, sulking below the hills as if it too would rather be indoors. The cold that follows is not the crisp, cheerful cold of a bracing morning walk. It is a heavy, searching cold that finds the gap in your cloak and the hole in your shoe and settles into your knuckles like an unwelcome guest who has decided to stay for the whole season. You're walking home across the fields, and here is a small joke the Middle Ages plays on everyone. The fields you are crossing are the reason you're so tired and so cold, and also the only reason you will eat at all. Farming in winter is mostly the noble art of standing in a frozen field, looking at frozen mud and deciding wisely to go back inside. Your breath hangs in front of you. The ruts in the lane have frozen into little ridges of iron, and somewhere behind you a bell begins to ring. But we will come to that bell, because that bell is going to run your entire evening, and it has a strange and rather bossy history. You can smell the village before you can clearly see it. That unmistakable perfume of a medieval winter, which is to say wood smoke, damp thatch, animals, and whatever is bubbling in a dozen different pots. To your modern nose, it might be a great deal all at once. To you, tonight, it is simply the smell of survival, of every household breathing warmth out into the freezing air. Each thin column of smoke rising from a rooftop is a family like yours, betting everything it has on a fire and a huddle. Here is a fact to keep you company on the path. The coldest stretch of these centuries was not simply bad luck. Historians and climate scientists now call the long chilly span from roughly the year 1300 to the 1800s the Little Ice Age, a slow global cooling that followed several warmer medieval centuries. You're walking, in other words, straight into one of the great cold chapters of the human story, dressed in wool and hope. Historians still argue whether that winter of 1408 was truly the worst of the age, or whether the frozen winter of 1434 and 35, when the Thames again turned to solid stone, deserves the grim crown instead. The people living through them did not take careful notes for the debate. They were far too busy trying to keep their fingers. There is the outline of your house now, low and dark against the last grey light, a thin ghost of smoke leaking from the roof. It does not look like much. It is, in fact, a small miracle of survival engineering, and I'm going to show you every clever, smoky, slightly ridiculous inch of it. But slowly. We have all night. Your house does not stand alone. It sits on a strip of ground the record clerks call a toft, your house plot, and behind it stretches the croft, a long fenced garden where in kinder months you grow the cabbages, beans, leeks and onions that will end up sooner or later swimming in your pot. Tonight the croft is a rectangle of unbroken snow, the bean rows just faint blue shadows beneath it. The whole thing fenced and quiet and fast asleep. Your toft sits in a row of other tofts, each with its own house and its own thread of smoke, strung along the lane like beads on a cold grey string. We actually know places like your village in extraordinary detail, because some of them were later abandoned and left in peace for the archaeologists to find. The most famous is a village called Warham Percy, up in the Yorkshire Wolds, which was slowly deserted in the late Middle Ages and then studied, plot by plot, for more than 40 years. Diggers there uncovered around 40 peasant house plots, 2 manor houses, a church and a mill, all laid out in neat, rows of tofts and crofts, a whole community mapped from its very bones. So when I describe your village to you tonight, I am not inventing it. I'm walking you through a real place, patiently rebuilt from post holes and property lines and centuries of careful trowel work. In a village like yours, not everyone is equal, even among the poor, because there is always a ladder, and someone is always standing on the rung just above you, looking faintly smug about it. The bigger plots belong to villains like you, who hold a decent slice of land in exchange for working the Lord's fields. The smaller, scrappier plots belong to cottagers who own little more than the roof over their heads and hire out their own 2 hands for a living. It is a hierarchy measured in cabbages and cow space, and everyone in the village knows precisely where they stand upon it. Up the gentle slope, a little apart and a little above, sits the manor, the Lord's house, larger, warmer, with actual separate rooms, which to you is an almost obscene luxury. The Lord himself may be present or away at another of his manors, or off at some war being terribly important. Either way, his hall is the reason your fields are farmed the way they are, and his reeve, a sort of medieval middle manager, chosen from among the peasants themselves, makes very sure that you show up to work. The quiet joke of it is that the reeve is one of your own neighbours, promoted just enough to make him thoroughly unpopular, clutching a tally stick instead of a whip, and somehow more feared than the Lord will ever be. Near the heart of the village stands the church, stone where everything else is timber, its squat tower the tallest thing for miles around. It is cold inside, gloriously, echoingly cold, but it is the one building meant to outlast every single person who kneels in it, and on the darkest nights of the year its bells and its saints' days give the whole calendar its shape. You will hear more of church bells tonight than you might expect, because in your world bells are not decoration. Bells are the clock, the alarm, the news, and the law, all swinging together on one fraying rope. You push through the little gate of your toft. The snow squeaks underfoot, that dry, high squeak that means the temperature has dropped well below freezing and fully intends to keep dropping. Against the side of the house leans your woodpile, and you glance at it the way a sailor glances at a darkening sky, doing the anxious winter arithmetic that every peasant does without being taught. How many logs, how many nights, how many long weeks until the world turns green again? A short woodpile in December is not a mild inconvenience. It is a genuine threat to your life, and you know it in your bones. Here is your quirky little detail for the walk-in. In many villages you did not simply own the right to burn wood as you pleased. You held a customary right written into the long memory of the manor to gather fallen and dead branches from the Lord's woods, an allowance the lawyers stiffly called estovers. The common phrase for it was gathering your wood by hook or by crook, meaning you could pull down dead branches with a curved billhook or a shepherd's crook, but you must never cut a living tree. So yes, that innocent little saying you still use today, by hook or by crook, may well be the frozen fingerprints of medieval peasants, quietly stocking their winter fires strictly within the rules. Historians still argue about why villages like Warham Percy were abandoned at all, whether it was the great sickness that hollowed them out, or grasping landlords turning good cropland into more profitable sheep pasture, or simply families giving up on thin, marginal soil after too many hard winters exactly like the one now closing in around you. The truth is most likely a slow braid of all three. Villages did not usually die in a single dramatic night. They faded instead, one empty toft at a time, until only the green earthworks remained for someone, centuries later to kneel down in the grass and read. But your village is not fading tonight. Tonight it is very much alive, every smoke hole breathing, every door shut tight, every family doing the same quiet, stubborn thing that you're about to do. You stamp the snow from your shoes, for all the good it does, since your shoes are essentially leather bags with opinions, and you lift the cold iron latch. Warmth, smoke, animal, family, the deep smell of something long simmered, it all rolls out to meet you in one soft grey cloud. You step inside, and you pull the door shut on the killing cold behind you. Now let me show you the room you have just walked into, because every single thing in it is here for a reason. Give your eyes a moment. Inside, the light is the colour of embers and old gold, and the air is soft with smoke that hangs in a blue-grey layer up near the roof where you have long since learned not to breathe. This is the whole house. One room. Not one room per person, not a room for cooking and a room for sleeping. One room for all of it, for all of you, and for the animals too. But we will get to your four-legged lodgers shortly. Look up first, at the bones of the place. The roof is held aloft by great curved timbers that rise from near the floor and lean in to meet high above your head, like the ribs of an upturned ship or a pair of enormous praying hands. This is called cruck construction, and each of those curved blades was very likely split from a single mighty oak, matched and raised as a pair. Your ancestors or the Lord's carpenter shaped these beams by eye and by axe, and they have stood for longer than anyone in the room can remember. In a world with almost no machinery, this timber skeleton is the single most valuable thing you own that you cannot eat. Between the timbers, the walls are woven and smeared into being. First, a lattice of thin, whippy hazel rods, woven in and out like a coarse basket, the wattle. Then over and through it, pressed by hand into every gap, the daub, a cheerful structural mud made of clay, sand, straw, and yes, a generous helping of animal dung. It sounds revolting. It is, in fact, brilliant. The straw binds it, the dung's fibres stop it cracking, and once dried it forms a wall that breathes a little, holds warmth and can be patched by anyone with a bucket and low standards, which on a night like this is all of you. Over your head the thatch is thick, a deep shaggy blanket of straw or reed, sometimes 2 feet deep, packed and pinned in overlapping courses. That depth is not laziness, it is insulation, and it is the reason the room holds any heat at all. The underside, if you could see it through the smoke, is black and glossy with decades of soot, and it hums faintly with life. Mice run its ridges, insects nest in it. The occasional bird treats your ceiling as prime real estate. Here is your quirky truth for the evening. A well-made thatched roof could last 50 years or more, quietly sheltering 3 generations of the same family and their livestock's fleas under the same warm straw. There is no chimney. I want you to sit with that, because it changes everything about the room you are in. The smoke from your fire does not travel up a neat brick flue. It rises, spreads under the thatch, and eventually feels its way out through a simple hole or a little slatted vent in the roof called a louve, and through the gaps in the walls and around the door. The whole upper half of your home is in effect a slow chimney. You live in the clear air beneath the smoke, ducking and stooping, and you have done it so long you no longer notice that you spend your evenings living, at waist height to your own ceiling. Windows? A luxury, and a cold one. You have perhaps 1 or 2 small openings closed tonight with a wooden shutter, and maybe a scrap of oiled cloth to let in a bruise of grey light by day. Glasses for churches and lords, and even at grand, well-studied Warren Percy, the discovery of a single peasant longhouse with actual glazed windows was surprising enough that the archaeologists made a special note of it. For you the rule is simple. Light means an open hole means cold, and on the longest night of the year you will happily trade every scrap of daylight for 1 more degree of warmth. Underfoot is the earth itself, beaten hard and flat by generations of feet, strewn with a scatter of dried rushes and straw that you sweep out and replace when it grows too foul. It is warmer than stone, and more forgiving, and it hides a multitude of dropped peas. The joke of the medieval floor is that it is technically green flooring and all natural and locally sourced, which are the exact words a modern shop would use to sell it back to you for a fortune. Historians still argue about just how filthy or how tidy these floors really were. Some point to later writers sneering at the English habit of rushes left down too long, matted with spills and scraps and worse. Others counter that a careful household swept and relaid its floor often, dressed it with sweet-smelling herbs, and kept it far cleaner than the sneering strangers claimed. The honest answer is that it surely varied house to house, exactly as homes vary today. Some peasants were proud housekeepers, and some, then as now, were absolutely not. But filthy or fragrant, this room is yours, and it is doing something remarkable simply by existing. Outside, the cold is climbing toward the kind of night that kills unlucky travellers and freezes the ale in the jug. In here, a low fire, thick walls of mud and straw, a deep roof, and the warm breath of everyone you love are combining into a fragile bubble of survivable air. Everything now depends on the small orange heart in the middle of the floor, so let us kneel down beside it, because the fire is the reason you are alive, and keeping it is the great unending work of your winter. And do not forget the door, because the door is where warmth goes to die. It is a low, heavy slab of planks on iron hinges, and around its edges the cold presses in with genuine determination, finding every crack. Along its foot you heap a roll of straw, or an old sack to block the draught, and just inside it the floor rushes lie thickest, held in place, some say, by a raised board across the base of the doorway. There is a pleasing old idea that this very board, the thing that held the threshing of rushes inside the room, is where we get our word threshold, the strip you step over to come in from the cold. Historians still argue over that tidy little etymology, as they argue over most tidy little etymologies, but standing here on a freezing night, stepping over that board into the warm, you can absolutely believe it. There it is. In the very centre of the room, ringed by a rough circle of blackened stone, sits the fire. Not roaring, not dramatic, just a low, steady orange breathing. This is a hearth in the oldest sense of the word. No grate, no mantel, no chimney breast, simply a fire laid on the ground at the heart of the home. Everything in the room is arranged around it, and so is everything in your day. The fire is your stove, your heater, your lamp, your clock, and your one reliable source of comfort. It is, if you like, the glowing screen the whole family gathers around. Each night, except this one, will genuinely kill you if you ignore it. Keeping it fed is a job that never truly ends. All through the warmer months you were, whether you noticed it or not, a person preparing for this night, gathering, drying, stacking, hoarding. Your main fuel is wood, gathered under those customary rites we spoke of, dead branches dragged from the Lord's woods by hook or by crook and split and seasoned until they burn clean. But wood is not your only fuel, and in many parts of the country it is not even the main one. Where you live near boggy ground, you may burn peat or turf, dense black bricks of half-rotted earth cut from the moor in summer with a special spade, stacked in the little pyramids to dry, and carried home to burn slow and smoky and long. The right to cut it even had its own lovely legal name, turbary, because in the Middle Ages absolutely everything to do with keeping warm was governed by somebody's rule. Where the moor gives you gorse, that spiny yellow-flowered furze, you burn that too, for a fast bright flame to wake a sleeping fire. And here is your slightly undignified quirky fact for the night. Where fuel was truly scarce, people burned dried animal dung patted into cakes and dried hard, which burned surprisingly well and once properly dry far less foully than you would fear. Warmth, in your world, is not proud. Watch how the fire is tended, because it is an art. You do not simply throw on a log and walk away. You feed it small and often, you rake the embers, you nudge the half-burnt ends inward, you shield it from the draught that sneaks under the door. In many homes, this is the particular ceaseless duty of the women and the children. A child crouched fireside, feeding twigs, is doing work every bit as vital as anyone out in the fields. To let the fire die completely in the depth of winter is more than a chore failed. It is a small disaster, because relighting it from cold, with flint and steel and a nest of dry tinder and a great deal of patient swearing, is slow, difficult work you would much rather avoid at dawn with frozen hands. Over the flames hangs the pot, but that is the next chapter of our night, and I can hear your stomach, so hold on, for now just feel the heat. Sit where you would sit, close, almost too close. Your shins pink and your back cold, because an open fire warms you fiercely on one side and abandons you entirely on the other. This is why medieval people are forever turning slowly before the fire like something on a spit, toasting first the front and then the back. The joke tells itself. You have invented central heating, except the central part is a single point, and the heating part requires you to rotate. Here is a fact that will make your smoky, chimneyless room feel a little less primitive. That open central fire, for all its faults, is actually better at heating a room than the grand wall fireplaces that came later. A fireplace with a chimney looks civilized, but it sends most of its warmth roaring straight up and out into the night sky. Your humble fire in the middle of the floor keeps its heat down where the people are, radiating in every direction, warming the very stones and the packed earth around it. You are not behind the times. You are, in a smoky sort of way, thermally efficient. Historians still argue about when, exactly, ordinary homes traded the open central hearth for the enclosed fireplace and chimney. Some tie it to a great wave of house rebuilding in the centuries after your time, when even middling families began adding upper floors and proper flues, chasing comfort and privacy and cleaner air. But for you tonight, in your low single room, the debate is happily irrelevant. You have your ring of stones, your breathing orange coals, your stack of wood and turf, and the oldest technology humans ever tamed, glowing gently in the dark, and soon, you know it is coming, a bell will ring across the frozen village and tell you, by ancient law, to put this precious fire to bed. But before that bell, before the long dark, there is the small matter of dinner. So swing your eyes back to the pot above the flames, because in a medieval winter, what is in that pot is the difference between merely cold and truly desperate, and there is a shadow over all this warmth, the shadow that will explain the bell you keep hearing, a fire in the middle, of a room made of dried mud, timber, straw floor covering, and a deep roof of tinder-dry thatch is, when you say it plainly, a controlled emergency that you sleep beside every night. One stray spark leaping up into that soot-black thatch, one log rolling loose while the household dozes, and the whole home can become a roaring pillar of flame faster than a family can wake and stumble out into the snow. In a village of houses packed wall to wall, one careless hearth can take the whole row with it. So the fire that keeps you alive is also the thing most likely to kill you, and everyone in your world knows it. Which is exactly why, across medieval Europe, the law itself came for the fire each night. Now, about those lodgers I promised you. Turn toward the lower end of the room, past a rough partition and a worn cross passage, and there, close enough to hear breathing in the dark, are the animals. In much of medieval Britain, especially in the north, the west and the hills of Wales and Devon, the peasant house was not merely near the beast but built as one long structure with them, a form the historians call the longhouse, or the byre house. People lived at the upper end, up the gentle slope of the floor. The animals lived at the lower end, the byre, where the muck could drain away downhill, and a single passage through the middle served them both. At Warren Percy, the excavated longhouses show exactly this plan, a living space with its central hearth at one end, a room that doubled as dairy and sleeping quarters, and a cow byre at the far end divided off by that cross passage. One roof, one family, one or two precious cattle all under the same deep thatch. And tonight, on the coldest night of the year, you're extremely glad of it, because your animals are not pets, and they are not only food and labour. Tonight they are furniture that produces heat. A single cow gives off a remarkable steady warmth, the slow furnace of a large body turning hay into life, and 2 or 3 animals breathing and shifting at the end of your house push the temperature up by a real, measurable, life-saving degree or 2. Their bodies are radiators that eat straw. Their breath is humid and warm. On a night that freezes ale in the jug and kills travellers on the road, the ox in your byre may be, quite literally, one of the reasons your children wake up in the morning. There is a cost to this arrangement, and your nose is filing a formal complaint about it right now. The smell is, let us say, agricultural, a thick weave of dung, damp hide, hay, milk, smoke, and unwashed human, all sealed in by shuttered windows and a blocked door. But you stopped truly smelling it years ago, the way people stop hearing a river they live beside. And here is the trade every peasant makes without hesitation. A powerful smell is a very small price to pay for warmth you do not have to gather, dry split or ration. The cow heats the house for free and never once lets the fire go out. The joke, of course, is that you are sharing your bedroom with livestock, and the livestock have the better end of the deal, fed, sheltered, warmed, and never once asked to go out, and stand in a frozen field. More than one weary medieval peasant must have lain in the dark, listening to a contented ox chewing its cud in the warm, and thought some version of, whose house is this exactly? These animals are also your wealth in its most concrete form. A peasant's ox is a tractor, a bank account, and an insurance policy with horns. To lose a beast in winter, to cold, to hunger, to disease, is a financial catastrophe you may not recover from for years. So you tend them carefully even now, forking down a little hay, breaking the ice on their water, checking the older cow that has been slow on her feet. Their survival and yours are braided together so tightly that it is genuinely hard to say who is keeping whom. Here is your quirky fact, and it is one worth carrying to sleep. The reason so many old country cottages feel snug is a principle your buyer understands perfectly. Living bodies are furnaces. Long before radiators, the cheapest central heating in the world was simply a warm animal and a closed door, a truth that shepherds, stable hands, and anyone who has ever hugged a big dog on a cold night knows in their bones. Historians still argue about just how common it really was for people and animals to share a single roof, whether the classic image of the cow in the corner was the everyday norm across all of England, or a regional habit of the wetter, hillier west and north that later got flattened into one tidy story about the medieval peasant. The buildings themselves, dug up and measured, suggest the honest answer is it depended enormously on where you lived. But in your village tonight, in the hills, it is simply how the winter is survived, and the cow is not going anywhere. So leave the beast to their hay and their heat, and come back up the slope toward the fire, because outside, faint and clear across the frozen dark, a bell has begun to toll. It is the bell that has been shadowing us all evening, and in your world, when that bell rings, the law itself reaches into your home and puts its hand upon your fire. Up in the rafters, if you keep them, the hens have gone quiet, roosting in a warm row along. A beam above the smoke, where the rising heat keeps their toes from freezing and the household keeps a jealous eye on the morning's eggs. A pig, if you're lucky enough to still have one this late in the year, grumbles in a corner pen. And at the buyer end, the day's last task is the gentlest one. A hand laid on a warm flank, a word or two murmured to a beast you have known since. It was a wobbling calf, a fork of hay pulled down within easy reach. There is a quiet intimacy to it that the cold word livestock entirely fails to capture. In the deep of the night, these animals will become a kind of company. The soft rhythmic sound of a cow chewing, the stamp of a hoof, the warm sigh of a large sleeping body, these are the sounds your ancestors drifted off to for thousands of years, and there is something in us that still finds them soothing. A modern sleep recording will sell you rain on a roof or a crackling hearth. You have the original version, entirely free, breathing in the dark at the end of the room, patiently turning hay into heat while you sleep. Listen. Out across the snow-muffled village, a bell is ringing, slow, even, deliberate. Not the joyful clamour of a feast day, but a single tolling voice counting. Out the end of the day, this is the curfew bell, and it is one of the strangest, bossiest, most quietly fascinating pieces of everyday life in your entire world. Because when this bell rings, you are expected by custom and often by actual law to cover your fire and put the day to bed. The word itself carries the whole story folded up inside it. Curfew comes from the old French couvre-feu, which means, simply and literally, cover fire. Say it a few times and you can hear the English word climb out of the French one. Couvre-feu, couvre-feu, curfew. It began not as a rule about children staying indoors, as we use the word now, but as a rule about flames, a nightly command to smother the open fires of a town before they could smother the town. In England, the custom is bound up with a very famous and rather stern figure. 2 years after he conquered the country at Hastings, in the year 1068, William the Conqueror is said to have ordered that at the ringing of an 8 o'clock bell, fires should be covered and the people should go to their rest. For William, this was nothing new. Curfew bells were already common back home in Normandy. Some say his reasons were as much political as practical, that a Norman king ruling a resentful English people rather liked the idea of everyone dousing their lights and staying indoors after dark, where they could not gather in the shadows and plot against him. And that gives us our small debate for the night, because historians still argue over what the curfew was truly for. Was it fire prevention, plain and sensible, in towns built almost entirely of timber and thatch where one loose flame could burn out a whole street? Or was it a tool of control, a way for rulers to still and silence a town after dark with the fire safety story as a convenient, respectable excuse? Most likely it was comfortably both at once. A rule that kept the peace and kept the town from burning down, which are two things medieval authorities were equally keen on. Whatever its true purpose, the nightly task it demanded of you was very real, and you are about to perform it. There was even a special object for the job, a household tool called, sensibly enough, a curfew, a large cover of metal, shaped rather like a domed shield, or in poorer homes a simple lid of pottery that could be set down over the smouldering hearth to trap the embers and choke off any live flame. Your quirky fact for the night is exactly this. Curfew was once not only a rule and a bell, but a thing, an object you could hold in your hands, a fire lid, and thousands of families across Europe owned one and used it every single night. You may not own so fine a metal cover, many peasants did not, but you know the method as well as your own name, because you have done it every winter night of your life. You do not throw water on the fire, that would waste it, and leave you with a cold, wet, smoky ruin to fight with at dawn. Instead, you tend it down. You rake the burning logs apart and push the hot embers into a tight heap at the centre and back of the hearth. Then you draw the cool grey ashes from the edges up and over the glowing coals, tucking them in like a blanket until the fire disappears from sight entirely. And here is the beautiful practical magic of it. Buried under that grey coat of ash, starved of the air it needs to blaze, the fire does not die. It sleeps, it smoulders, low and slow and hidden, all through the long night, giving off a gentle warmth without a single dangerous flame. This is called banking the fire, and it is one of the great unsung skills of the pre-modern world. Done well, it means no house fire while you sleep, no wasted fuel, and, best of all, a living heart of coal still glowing at first light, ready to be uncovered, fed a little dry kindling, and breathed back into flame with a few puffs instead of a frozen half-hour of flint and steel and despair. The joke of the curfew is that it is the medieval world's version of a very modern bedtime routine. A bell tells you to put your device to sleep, dim the lights, and stop staying up doing something faintly dangerous. Some things, it seems, humans have always needed a little help remembering. So you kneel, and you rake, and you bank your fire down to a secret orange glow beneath the ashes. The room dims. The bright dancing light is gone. And now, in the hush that follows the bell, with the fire safely asleep and the cold pressing harder at the walls, your family turns to the last warm business of the day, which is, of course, supper. That same bell, or its brothers up in the church tower, will rule the rest of your life too, not merely your fire. Bells wake the village, call it to labour, summon it to worship, warn it of danger, and mourn its dead. In a world without a clock in every pocket, and without for most people a clock at all, the tolling of a bell is how time itself is announced across the frozen fields. The man who rings it holds a small but genuine power. He is, in a sense, the keeper of the hours, and a village whose bell falls silent is a village that has half lost track of the very day. As for breaking the curfew, well, in a great walled town it might earn you a fine, a sharp word from the watch. Or worse, for anyone caught abroad with a naked flame after the bell had rung. In a small village like yours, the enforcement is far softer, more a matter of custom, and plain common sense than of officers hammering at the door. Everyone banks their fire because everyone has seen, at least once in their life, what happens to the family that did not. The bell does not need to threaten you. The memory of a neighbour's burnt-out toft does that quiet work well enough. Supper, then. And here I must gently lower your expectations, because if you have come to the Middle Ages hoping for a groaning table of roast swans and spiced wine, you have arrived at the wrong house. In your home, on this freezing night, supper is what it is almost every night. Pottage. A thick, soft, endlessly forgiving stew simmered in the single iron pot that hangs above your banked and glowing hearth. And there is a very good chance the pot has been quietly cooking in one form or another for days. Into the pottage goes whatever the year has given you, and the winter has not yet taken. Peas and beans, dried hard in the autumn and softened back to life by long cooking. Onions and leeks and cabbage from the croft, or their memory. A handful of barley or oats to thicken it. Dried herbs for what little brightness they can offer. And if the family can spare it, a small and precious amount of salted meat or bacon, shredded fine so that its flavour travels through the whole pot, and everyone gets the ghost of it. If not the substance, it is not glamorous. But it is hot, it is filling, it is nourishing, and on a night like this, hot and filling and nourishing is a form of wealth. That precious salt meat has a season and a story, and its name is Martinmas. On the 11th of November, the feast of St. Martin, villages across medieval Europe held a great slaughter. It was a hard, practical calculation dressed as a holy day. The pastures were bare, the cold was coming, and you simply could not feed every animal through the long, hungry winter. So the beasts that would not be kept, for breeding or for spring, were killed all at once in a bloody, busy, oddly festive few days. And then the real work began, of turning all that meat into food that would last. Here is your quirky fact, and it is a good one. Almost nothing was wasted, and the methods were ingenious. Meat was rubbed and packed with coarse salt in barrels, layer upon layer, the salt drawing out the moisture that would otherwise rot it. Other cuts were hung in the smoke of the fire until they were dark and dry and would keep for months. Blood became black pudding. Fat became tallow for your lamps and your cooking. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, were buried in boxes of dry sand, which kept them cool, kept the air from them, and kept them firm and edible deep into the cold months. Apples and pears were laid in straw-lined barrels, not touching, checked and turned so that one rotten fruit could not spoil the rest. Your larder is not large, but it is clever, and every trick in it was learned the hard way, over centuries by people who could not afford to learn it any other way. To drink there is ale, small ale, weak and nourishing, brewed in the village and safer than much of the water, and warm and comforting on a cold night. There is coarse dark bread, heavy and chewy, made from whatever grain the harvest allowed, sometimes eked out in the lean years with beans or acorns ground into the flour. And there is, above all, the pot, which never quite empties, only gets topped up, a little more water, a few more peas, tomorrow's leftovers folded into today's, so that the family's food is less a series of separate meals than one long, slow communal stew that runs, like the fire beneath it, all winter. The joke of medieval eating is that you have accidentally invented the trendiest ideas in modern cooking several centuries early. Everything is local, everything is seasonal, nothing is wasted, and dinner is a slow-cooked, plant-forward bone broth stew simmered all day in a single pot. People now pay good money and buy special machines to eat exactly the way. You eat because you have no other choice. You would trade all of it instantly for one reliable winter of plenty. Historians still argue about just how grim or how decent the medieval peasant diet really was. The old picture was one of near-constant near-starvation, grey and joyless. But more recent work, looking closely at what actually went into the pot, suggests that in a normal year the peasant diet was surprisingly balanced and nutritious, heavy in fibre, vegetables, and grains, lighter in the sugar and rich meats that plagued the wealthy, and quite capable of keeping a hard-working body strong. The problem was never really an ordinary winter. The problem was the bad year, the failed harvest, the winter that came too early or stayed too long, and those, as we will see, could turn a thin diet into a deadly one with terrible speed. But tonight is not a famine night. Tonight the pot is full enough. The bread is cut, the ale is poured, and your family gathers close in the dim glow to eat with wooden spoons from wooden bowls, shoulders touching. The animals warm at the far end, the fire sleeping under its grey ash. It is a small, ordinary, deeply human scene, repeated in 10,000 villages across a frozen continent. And when the bowls are scraped and set aside, there is one more battle to prepare for before sleep. The battle to keep the cold out of your very clothes and skin. So let us talk about what you are wearing, because in your world, staying warm is something you must wear, layer by careful layer. There is a discipline to eating in winter that the well-fed find hard to picture. Every barrel of salted meat, every sack of dried beans, every box of sanded roots must be stretched from the slaughter of November all the way to the first green things of spring, and spring in a bad year can arrive cruelly late. So your mother, or your wife, or you yourself become a quiet accountant of the larder, counting and rationing, deciding how thin the pottage can go tonight so that there is still something left in the pot through the lean grey weeks of March. The stretch the country people grimly call the hungry gap. Every winter meal is eaten with one eye on all the meals still to come. Look down at yourself. You're dressed as you're always dressed in winter, in wool, layer upon patient layer of it, because wool is the miracle fibre of your world and the single most important thing standing between your skin and the killing cold. It is warm even when damp. It is spun and woven in the village from the backs of the very sheep you can hear shifting in the dark, and it can be dyed, felted, patched, and handed down until it is more patch than cloth. Whatever else your world lacks, it does not lack wool, and thank the saints for that. Against your skin, if you are fortunate, is a shirt or shift of linen, cool and smooth and washable. The one layer you can actually clean with any ease, which matters more than you might think. Over that goes a woolen tunic, and perhaps a second, and over that a heavier gown or a coarse over-tunic, and over all of it a thick cloak or a mantle, hooded, that you can pull tight and even sleep in if the night demands it. On your legs, woolen hose, on your feet, hose and then simple shoes of leather, turned and stitched, wonderful for a dry summer path and nearly useless against snow. On your hands, mittens rather than gloves, because mittens keep the fingers together where they can share their warmth, a piece of folk wisdom. Your ancestors worked out long before anyone could explain why, and here is your quirky, slightly itchy fact for the night. When the cold is truly cruel, you stuff things. Straw, dry grass, moss, rags, wool scraps, pushed into your shoes to lift your feet off the frozen ground and pad them warm, tucked into gaps in your clothing, layered under your cloak. A medieval peasant dressed for the deep of winter is, to be honest, a walking haystack with a face, insulated by whatever the barn and the field can spare. It is not elegant. But elegance has never kept a single toe from freezing, and you gave up caring about elegance somewhere around your first hard frost. Even so, and this is the hard truth of your world, you are cold. Not dramatically, not always, but persistently, in a low and grinding way that a modern person, raised in heated rooms, can scarcely imagine. You are cold at the edges of the fire. You're cold when you step away from it. You're cold in your hands and your feet and the tip of your nose for months on end, and you have simply made peace with a background hum of chill as the ordinary texture of winter life. Your body has adapted in small ways. You run a little warmer, you shiver a little less. You notice the cold a little later than a soft modern body would, but adaptation is not the same as comfort. The cold leaves its marks on you too. Your hands and feet may bloom with chilblains, those red, swollen, maddeningly itchy patches where cold-shrunk skin is warmed too fast. A small, nagging misery that generations knew intimately and that has become almost a rarity in the heated world. Your knuckles crack, your lips split. The very old and the very young feel it worst of all, and we will come to them, gently, later in the night. For now, simply understand that warmth, in your world, is never a given. It is a thing you build, wear, gather, tend, and defend every hour of every winter day. The joke you would appreciate if you could see forward 6 centuries is that people in the future will pay handsomely for clothes made of the exact same wool you're wearing, marketed as rugged, natural, and artisanal, and will speak with great feeling about the joy of a chunky hand-knitted jumper. You, who have never in your life worn anything but rugged, natural, artisanal wool, would look at them with the flat, tired expression of a person who has never once had a choice in the matter. There is a warmth you carry that has nothing to do with cloth, and it is worth naming before we settle down. It is the warmth of belonging, of being one body in a household of bodies, one family in a village of families, all of you facing the same cold with the same stubborn, ordinary courage. In your world, no one is warm alone. You survive the winter shoulder to shoulder, sharing beds, sharing fires, sharing the last of the salt meat when a neighbour's child is sick, because everyone understands, without needing to say it, that warmth shared is warmth multiplied, and cold-faced alone is how people die. Historians still argue about how the medieval body truly experienced cold, whether centuries of hard living genuinely made people more physically resistant to it, or whether they suffered every bit as much as we would and simply had no words, no thermometers, and no choice but to endure. What is beyond argument is that they endured, winter after winter wrapped in wool and each other, and now, well-fed and well-wrapped, with the fire banked and the animals warm and the night deepening toward its cruel middle, it is nearly time to face the last and most important act of survival, going to bed. But first, we must talk about light, because the moment that fire went under the ashes, your world became darker than you have ever known dark to be. You do not, by the way, undress for bed the way a modern sleeper does. On a night this cruel, you may loosen your outer layers and no more, sleeping in your shift and even your tunic, your cloak thrown over the top as one more blanket. Washing, in the deep of winter, is a brisk and minimal affair, a splash of cold water, a wipe of the hands and face. For heating enough water to truly bathe would burn fuel you cannot spare, and standing wet and naked in a freezing room is a fast road to a killing chill. So you are warm and you are wrapped, and you are, by the honest standards of your age, doing perfectly well. Cleanliness can wait for the thaw. Now, about the dark. The moment you raked those ashes over the coals, something happened that a modern person almost never experiences, and it is worth pausing on, because it shapes everything about the night ahead. The room went truly deeply dark. Not the soft grey dark of a bedroom with a streetlight leaking through the curtains, not the glow of a dozen little standby lights blinking in the corners. Real dark, the old dark, the kind of dark where you cannot see your own hand, where the world shrinks to the size of what you can touch, and where the faint orange breathing of the banked fire is the only proof that anything exists at all. If you want light now, you must make it, and light is not free. Your everyday lamp is the humblest one imaginable, the rushlight. To make it, you gather common rushes from the wet ground in summer. Strip away most of the green skin to reveal the soft white pith inside. Dry it, and then draw it again and again through hot melted fat. The very same tallow and grease left over from cooking, saved and rendered down, because nothing is ever wasted. The result is a long, thin, fat-soaked wick that you clip at an angle into a simple metal holder and touch to the fire. It gives, to be honest, a poor and smoky little flame, perhaps a quarter of the light of a proper candle, a small trembling glow that throws vast shadows and fills the air with a faint smell of burning fat, but it is astonishingly cheap. A whole household could burn rushlights all year, for the cost of £1 or £2 of gathered rushes and saved kitchen grease, and here is your quirky fact for the dark. Historians estimate a typical family needed only around £1.50 of rushes a year to keep itself in light. Your lamp costs almost nothing but the work of your own hands, which is the medieval definition of affordable. Candles exist, of course, but they are a step up in the world. Tallow candles made from rendered sheep or cow fat give a better, steadier light, but they smoke, they smell, they gutter, and they are dear enough that a poor family uses them sparingly if at all. Candles of beeswax, clean burning and sweet smelling, are finer still, and precisely because they are so fine they are mostly reserved for the church, the altar, and the tables of the rich. When you kneel in that cold stone church and see it softly ablaze with beeswax candles on a feast day, you are looking at real glowing wealth, light as luxury, burning in the dark. So in your home, light is rationed the way food is rationed. You do not leave a rushlight burning for the pleasure of it. You light it to finish a necessary task, a last bit of mending, checking on a sick child, finding your way to the bed, and then you put it out and let the honest dark return. Your evenings are not lit up and stretched long into the night as ours are. They are short and dim and shaped entirely around the rising and setting of the sun, because the sun is the one light source that costs you nothing at all. This is why your whole rhythm of life bends toward the daylight. In summer you rise absurdly early and work absurdly long, gorging on the free light while it lasts. In winter, when the dark swallows 2/3 of the day, you simply surrender to it, going to bed not long after nightfall because there is little you can do and less you can afford to burn, and because sleep, blessed sleep, is warm and free and asks nothing of your woodpile. The joke of it, which you would only understand from the far side of history, is that your screen time ends automatically every single night when the tallow burns low and no amount of willpower can extend it. You have the perfect digital detox, enforced by economics and the plain black dark. People 6 centuries from now will build special expensive candles and dim their glowing rectangles and pay for wind-down routines, trying, and mostly failing, to recreate the exact bedtime your poverty and your rushlight hand you for free. And the dark is not empty either. It is full of stories, of spirits, of saints and sinners, and things that go bump beyond the daub. The night in your world has a rich and slightly frightening culture all its own. The hour of ghosts and the walking dead, of prayers whispered against the things you cannot see, of the comforting knowledge that the whole household is sealed in together and the door is barred. Historians still argue about how genuinely fearful pre-modern people truly were of the darkness. Those who pore over old diaries and court records debate whether the dark was a terror to be endured or simply a familiar companion, threaded with its own routines, prayers, and quiet freedoms. The likeliest truth is that it was both, at once, the way the dark still is for a child and for the child that stays hidden inside every adult. But you're not afraid tonight. You're tired, and fed, and wrapped in wool, and the fire is sleeping safely under its ash. The rushlight has done its small work and been pinched out, and now there is only one warm place left to go. So let me show you your bed, which is, I promise you, not at all what you're picturing, and is held together by cleverness, straw, and the heat of the people you love. On a clear night, the moon becomes something you actually plan your life around. A full moon, the country people fondly call it the parish lantern, turns a black and dangerous landscape into a silver road you can travel by, and journeys, markets, and late work were often timed to catch its light. Tonight, through a chink in the shutter, that cold moon lays a thin blue blade of light across the floor, and it is, entirely for free, brighter than your little rushlight ever managed to be. Here is your bed, and I want you to lower your expectations one final time tonight, because for a peasant family this is unlikely to be a grand, wooden 4-poster with carved posts and heavy hangings. That splendour belongs to the Lord up the hill. For you, the bed is far simpler and far cleverer than it looks. At its heart, a great sack of cloth stuffed full of straw, a pallet laid on a low wooden frame if you're doing well, or on the packed earth floor itself if you're not. What goes inside that sack matters enormously, and there is a whole quiet hierarchy of comfort folded into it. At the very bottom of the ladder is plain straw, cheap, scratchy, quick to flatten into a hard mat, but warm and endlessly replaceable. A step up is chaff, or dried grass, or better still bed straw, an actual plant named for this very purpose, softer and sweeter smelling than field straw. Better again is a mattress stuffed with wool, springy and warm and wonderful. And at the very top, the stuff of dreams, is a bed of feathers, soft, deep, gloriously insulating, which is precisely why a good feather bed was a treasured possession, listed in wills and handed down like an heirloom, generation to generation. Your quirky and slightly unwelcome fact for bedtime is this: that straw mattress is typically emptied and refilled only about once a year, which means that all the small guests who have moved into it over the months, the fleas, the lice, the bedbugs, are for the most part simply accepted as fellow travellers, an itchy tax on being warm and horizontal. Nearly everyone in your world sleeps this way, from the peasant to, honestly, a fair few nobles, and nearly everyone has made a private peace with the fact that a bed is a shared ecosystem. You scratch, you sigh, and you sleep anyway, because the alternative is the floor and the cold. For your head, if you are lucky, there is a bolster, a long firm cushion stuffed like the mattress. If you are not so lucky, there is a folk solution so blunt it is almost funny. A smooth round log, or a shaped block of wood laid under the neck. To keep your head off the cold ground, it sounds medieval in the worst sense, but a wooden headrest is warmer than bare earth. It keeps you off the drafty floor, and generations slept on far worse. Consider it the original firm pillow. Extremely firm, memory of nothing, guaranteed never to go soft. Over the top go your coverings, and here you pile on everything you have. A linen sheet, if the household owns one. Woolen blankets, coarse and heavy and warm. A coverlet or two, perhaps an animal skin, a sheepskin is a prize, thrown over your feet. And on the coldest nights, the very cloaks you wore all day, spread across the whole huddle as one more layer. The bed is not one neat set of matching linens. It is a nest, an accumulation, a warm heap assembled from every soft and heavy thing the family owns. And then there is the oldest trick of all for a frozen bed: heat a stone. All evening, tucked at the edge of the hearth, a smooth flat stone or a brick has been quietly soaking up the fire's warmth. Now wrapped in a scrap of cloth so it will not scorch, it goes down into the bed by your feet, a small, patient, radiating heart of stored heat that will hold the worst of the cold at bay for hours. It is the hot water bottle 4 or 5 centuries early, and it works so well that the basic idea never really went away. But the greatest source of warmth in this bed is not the straw, or the stone, or the piled wool. It is each other. Your whole family sleeps together, close, layered like spoons in a drawer. Parents, children, sometimes a grandparent, sometimes a servant or a guest. And this is not thought strange or improper in the slightest. It is simply sense. Every body is a small furnace, and pressed together under the blankets, all those small furnaces make a shared pocket of warmth far greater than any one of you could build alone. In your world, to sleep alone in winter is not a luxury. It is a danger, and a lonely one. The joke here writes itself. Your entire family shares one bed out of sheer necessity, and future centuries will invent the phrase personal space as though it were some ancient human right, rather than a warm and recent privilege built entirely on central heating. You would find the idea of each child in a separate cold room not a comfort but a quiet cruelty. Warmth is togetherness. The two words mean nearly the same thing in your world. Historians still argue, by the way, about that cosy old phrase, sleep tight, whether it truly comes from the ropes that were strung across some wooden bed frames and needed tightening to keep the mattress from sagging, or whether tight simply meant soundly, as it still can. It is a lovely story either way, and like so many lovely stories about the past, it may be half true, half tidy invention, but the wish behind it is real and ancient, that you sleep sound, sleep warm, sleep safe through the long cold dark, so climb in, settle down among the warm bodies and the piled wool, because now, at last, it is time for your first sleep. And yes, I said your first sleep because your night is about to do something that will genuinely surprise you. There is an order to the huddle, 2 worked out long ago without anyone ever quite deciding it. The smallest children go to the middle, the warmest and safest place. walled in on every side by larger, warmer bodies. The parents take the colder edges facing outward, nearest the door and the dark. It is a quiet nightly act of love that no one names and no one praises, the grown-ups taking the cold without a word so that the little ones need not. So settle in. Let your body sink into the straw, into the warm hollow made by the people around you, and feel the day begin, at last, to let go of you. The bowls are put away, the door is barred, the fire is a secret orange heartbeat beneath its blanket of ash. The animals have gone quiet at the far end of the room, and one by one the small sounds of the household soften and slow. A child's whisper hushed, a cough, the creak of the frame, the long settling sigh of a family lying down together against the cold. This is a tiredness you have earned honestly, in a way few modern people ever do. Your work is the work of muscle and weather, hauling, digging, hauling, splitting, walking miles through mud and snow, hands and back and legs all spent by the time the dark comes down. There is no lying awake fretting over things you cannot touch. Sleep, for you, is not a problem to be solved with routines and remedies. It arrives like a heavy warm tide the moment you stop moving, and it takes you down deep and fast. And here is the surprising thing, the thing I promised would catch you off guard. In your world, this is not the whole night's sleep. This is only your first sleep. Because across much of the pre-modern world, people did not sleep the way we are taught to. One long, unbroken block of 8 hours, start to finish. They slept in 2 shifts, a first sleep beginning soon after dark, running for a few hours down into the belly of the night, then a natural waking, and then later a second sleep carrying them through to the dawn. We know this because a historian named Roger Kirch spent decades reading, through thousands of old documents, diaries, court records, medical books, prayers, poems, letters, and kept finding the same phrases, over and over, treated as utterly ordinary. The first sleep, the second sleep, the watch in between. People wrote about waking in the deep of the night the way we might write about waking to use the bathroom. Not as a problem, not as insomnia, simply as a normal part of how a night was shaped. Your quirky fact for the dark is that this pattern was so unremarkable to the people who lived it that they barely bothered to explain it, which is exactly why it took a modern historian reading between 1,000 lines to rediscover it centuries later. For now, though, that second sleep is hours away, and the first is pulling you under. The last thing your fading mind registers is sound, the deep, slow breathing of your family, the shift and chew of a beast in the dark, the wind pressing its cold hands against the door and finding no way in, the tiny tick and settle of the timbers as the frost tightens its grip on the world outside. It is, though you would never call it this, a lullaby. The oldest lullaby there is, the sound of shelter holding against the night. If you dream, your dreams will be taken seriously come morning, for in your world a dream is not mere noise from a tired brain. It may be a message, a warning, an omen, a visit from a saint or from the restless dead. People remembered their dreams, told them, puzzled over them, and sometimes changed their plans because of them. The line between the sleeping world and the waking one is thinner in your age, more porous, more alive with meaning. You lie now on the very edge of that line, slipping across. The joke, if you had breath left to laugh at it, is that a modern sleeper spends money on a tracking device to measure the depth and quality of their rest, chasing a perfect score they rarely reach. You, on your flea-ridden straw sack with a log for a pillow and a cow for a roommate, are about to sleep the kind of deep, dreamless, bone-earned sleep that no device could improve and no amount of money can buy. You would win every sleep score in the future, and you would never know or care. Historians still argue about just how universal this 2-sleep pattern truly was, whether every household everywhere split the night in 2, or whether the picture is messier, varying by place and season, and the simple length of the winter dark. Some recent scholars have pushed back, pointing out that the evidence, while real, is patchier than the neat story suggests. But whatever the fine print, something in the human animal, left in a long dark night without artificial light, does seem to drift toward this rhythm: sleep, wake, rest, sleep again. And in a few hours, in the cold heart of the night, your own body is going to do exactly that. So sleep now, your first sleep. I will still be here when you wake. Notice as you drift how the cold has become a distant thing, a pressure at the walls, a sound rather than a feeling. Inside the nest of blankets and bodies the air has warmed to something almost gentle, your breath and everyone's breath and the animal's breath pooling into a shared warmth that the thick thatch holds close. This is the whole point of everything you did tonight. The walls, the fire, the wool, the huddle, all of it bent toward this one. Soft pocket of survivable air, and now, having built it, you get simply to disappear into it. And you are going down early by modern reckoning. Perhaps only 2 or 3 hours after full dark, which in deep midwinter means you are asleep not long after what we would call the early evening. But the winter night is enormously long this far north. 14, 15, 16 hours of darkness, far more than anybody needs for a single sleep. There is time, in a night that vast, for 2 full sleeps and a long waking in between, with hours to spare. Your ancestors did not split the night in 2 out of some quaint custom. They did it because the winter dark simply handed them more night than one sleep could ever fill. While you sleep, let us step, just for a little while, outside. Not into the cold, you are far too warm and safe for that now, but in our imagination, up through the smoke hole and out over the frozen roof, to see the world your walls are holding back. Because part of understanding how people survived these nights is understanding clearly what it was they were surviving. Above the village the sky has cleared, and that is the cruelest kind of winter night, the clear ones when there are no clouds to hold the day's thin warmth, and the heat of the earth escapes straight up, into a hard black sky pricked with more stars than any modern city dweller will ever see. The cold on a night like this does not blow. It settles, heavy and total, drawing the last warmth out of everything, the frozen ruts of the lane, the iron-hard fields, the still black water of the pond, locked under its lid of ice. Nothing moves. The whole landscape has been hushed and stilled and turned to glass. Out here, beyond the last toft, the cold is not an inconvenience, it is a predator. A traveller caught on the road after dark on a night like this, a peddler who misjudged the distance, a drunk who wandered from the alehouse, a shepherd who went out for a lost ewe, is in real and mortal danger. Exposure kills quietly and even, at the end, almost gently. The shivering stops, a false warmth creeps in. The desire to simply lie down and rest becomes overwhelming. Every village has its stories of someone found frozen in a ditch at first light, and those stories are not told for drama. They are told as warnings, passed down so the young will respect the dark and the cold the way you respect a blade. There are older dangers in the dark too, or at least the memory of them. In the wilder parts of the land and in earlier centuries and all across the great forests of the continent, the wolf still ran, and the winter, when hunger drove the packs closer to human settlements, was when people feared it most. By your time in England, the wolf is growing rare, hunted and harried toward its end, a shadow retreating into the wildest north. But the fear of it lingers in the stories, long after the animal itself has thinned, in the tales told to children about what waits in the trees, in the very shape of the nightmares your world hands down. Your quirky, half-frightening fact is that historians still argue over exactly when England's last wild wolf was killed. The records are vague, the claims are many, and the truth dissolves, fittingly, into the same dark forest the wolves came from. In the towns, the dark is policed. A night watch walks the streets after the curfew bell, lantern in hand, calling the hours, checking for fire and for trouble, challenging anyone abroad without good reason. The town gates are shut and barred at nightfall, sealing the community inside its walls until dawn, a nightly locking up of the whole settlement against whatever the darkness might bring. But your village has no walls and no watch. It has only the barred doors of its houses, the closeness of its neighbours, and the shared understanding that after dark everyone stays in, everyone banks their fire, and everyone waits together for the light. And the night is peopled, in the medieval mind, with more than wolves and frost. This is the hour of spirits and of the walking dead, of the wild hunt that some said swept across the winter sky, of ghosts and portents and the thin, uneasy sense that the barrier between the living and the dead grows flimsy in the deep midwinter dark. You may laugh at it warm in your bed, but step outside alone at 3 a.m. into a silent, frozen, starlit world where you cannot see past your own breath, and some very old part of you will understand exactly why your ancestors preferred to stay indoors and keep the door firmly barred. The joke, gentle as it is that your entire village has independently arrived at the wisest possible winter policy. Stay inside, stay warm, stay together, and do absolutely nothing outdoors after dark. A policy that people 6 centuries later, with all their heating and their lights, will rediscover every snowy evening when they cancel their plans and decide wisely to stay home on the sofa. But inside your walls, none of this can reach you. The wolves are only stories, the cold is only a sound at the door, the spirits are kept out by the barred door and the sleeping fire, and the murmured prayers of the household. You are warm, and you are held, and you're exactly where survival demands you be. And in the deep middle of this very night, you're going to open your eyes not in fear, but in the most natural way in the world. Welcome to the watch. Consider that black pond under its lid of ice, down at the edge of the village. By day the children are warned away from it in the sternest voice their mother's own, because thin ice over deep cold water is one of the quiet killers of a country winter, and every parish remembers a child it took. Tonight the ice is thick and safe and rings hard as iron underfoot, but the warning does not soften with the season. The cold in your world is not one danger but a whole family of them, each with its own patient way of catching the careless. And yet, for all its terrors, the night is not endless, and everyone out here knows it in their marrow. That is the deep, unspoken comfort your whole village is leaning on tonight, that the dark, however vast, however cruel, will end, as it has ended every night since the beginning of the world. The sun will come back. The bell will ring for morning. The fire will be uncovered and breathed back to life. Survival in your world is very often simply this: the quiet, stubborn faith that if you can only hold warm and still and together until the light returns, you will have won. And now, some hours later, in the cold heart of the night your eyes open, not with a start, not with fear, not because a child cried, or a noise came from the dark. You simply wake gently and completely, the way you might surface from deep water into still air, and you lie there for a moment in the warm dark, unhurried, unworried, entirely at peace. Your first sleep is over. The watch has begun. This is the strange, lovely, half-forgotten hour I promised you, the waking between the two sleeps, a stretch of quiet consciousness that might last an hour, sometimes two, in the deepest part of the night. And crucially, in your world, this waking is not a problem. It is not insomnia. It is not a sign that anything is wrong. It is simply what the body does when handed a night this long, and everyone you know does it too, and no one thinks twice about it. So what do? Awake in the small hours with the whole world asleep around you? Anything and nothing. The hour is yours. Some people simply lie still and let their minds wander, turning over the day, the season, the small quiet thoughts that only surface when there is nothing else to do. Some rise briefly to relieve themselves, to check on a restless child, to look in on the animals, to add one small log to the glowing, coals and coax a little more warmth into the room. Many, in your deeply religious world, use the watch to pray. This was seen as an ideal time for it. The mind rested, the world silent, the distractions of the day gone, the soul somehow closer to heaven in the still dark. Devotional writers actually recommended these midnight wakeful hours for prayer and reflection, and monks, of course, built their entire lives around rising in the dead of night to sing the office in the cold of the church. For a peasant in a warm bed, it might be no more than a few murmured words, a familiar prayer half spoken into the dark, a small reaching out to God in the one quiet hour of the day that belongs to no one else. And couples, lying warm together while the children sleep, often use the watch for the oldest and most human of purposes. It is worth saying plainly and gently, this quiet middle-of-the-night hour, private and unhurried, was frequently the time when medieval husbands and wives were intimate, and some physicians of the age even considered it the healthiest time for it, the body rested and restored by that first deep sleep. Your quirky fact for the watch, then, is that a good deal of the medieval world was quite possibly conceived not at bedtime and not at dawn, but here, in the hushed hollow between the first sleep and the second. The mood of the watch is unlike any hour in a modern life. There is no light to tempt you into activity, no glowing screen, no work that can be done, no reason at all to hurry back to sleep. There is only the dark, the warmth, the breathing of the people you love, the faint red pulse of the fire, and time, soft, formless, unclaimed time. It is a kind of peace that our lit-up, always-on world has very nearly abolished, and that some part of us, lying awake at 3 a.m. fighting to get back to sleep, still dimly remembers and quietly craves. The joke, of course, is that a modern person who wakes at 3 a.m. treats it as a crisis, reaching for the phone, checking the time in a panic, lying rigid with worry about how tired they will be tomorrow. You, in the same hour, simply pray a little, poke the fire, murmur to your spouse, and drift easily back down. You have accidentally mastered the one thing the future will spend billions trying and failing to buy, a calm and untroubled mind in the middle of the night. And here is the fact that ties it all together, and it is a genuinely remarkable one. In the 1990s, a sleep researcher took a group of thoroughly modern people and did something simple. He gave them long nights of darkness, 14 hours at a stretch, with no artificial light week after week. and slowly, without being told to, their sleep changed. It split. It broke naturally into two, blocks with a quiet, wakeful interval between them. The first sleep, the watch, the second sleep, exactly as the old records described. The pattern was not a medieval quirk at all. It was, it seems, sleeping right there inside the human body all along, waiting only for the return of a long, dark, unlit night to call it back. Historians and scientists still argue over the details, how universal it truly was, how much it varied with place and season and light, whether the tidy two-sleep story flattens a messier reality. But something real is there, buried in the diaries and the court records and the sleepy bodies of modern volunteers alike, and you are living it right now in the warm dark at peace. The watch is ending, your eyes grow heavy again, the second sleep is reaching up for you, so let yourself sink back down, and while you do, let me tell you why the winters of your world grew so very cruel in the first place. For a few, the watch was not restful at all, but useful. In the towns, a baker might rise in these black hours to begin the day's bread, so it would be warm and ready by dawn. A thief might choose exactly this hour to be about his work, counting on a sleeping world. A new mother might feed her infant and doze between. But for you, a tired farmer in a warm bed with nowhere to be and nothing that cannot wait for the light, the watch asks nothing at all. It is simply a gift of quiet, handed to you nightly by the sheer, generous length of the winter dark. Here is a question you never ask, because you have no way to ask it, but which hangs over your whole cold life like the frost hangs over the fields. Why is it so hard? Why do the old people mutter that the winters were softer when they were young? Why does the harvest fail more often than the tales say it used to? You cannot know the answer. But we can, looking back across the centuries with instruments and ice, cores and tree rings your world could never dream of, and the answer has a name. You're living through the beginning of what we call the Little Ice Age. To understand it, you have to go back before your grandparents' grandparents to a run of centuries, roughly the 900s to the 1200s, that historians call the medieval warm period. Those were, by the standards of your cold present, golden years. The summers were warmer and steadier. The growing seasons were longer. Harvests were generally good, and when harvests are good, people eat and marry and have children who live. And so the population of Europe swelled through those warm centuries to heights it had not seen since the days of Rome. They were warm enough that things happened which would astonish you. Grapevines grew and wine was made in the south of England, in places far too cold for it in your day. Far to the north, Norse settlers sailed to a great ice-fringed island, found its southern coast green enough to farm and called it hopefully Greenland, building homes and churches and grazing cattle on grass that the coming cold would eventually bury. The warm world had room in it for such ambitions. It was, in its quiet way, a golden age of climate, and nobody living in it had the faintest idea that it was about to end. And then, around the year 1300, around the very time your world begins, it turned. Slowly at first, then unmistakably, the climate of the northern hemisphere began to cool. The summers grew shorter and wetter. The winters grew longer and harder. The glaciers high in the Alps, which had been shrinking for centuries, stopped, and then began to grind forward again, swallowing high pastures and even whole mountain villages. The warm world was closing, and the long cold was coming down, and it would not fully lift for 500 years. What caused it is still argued over, but the leading suspects are grand and sky-filling. The sun itself seems to have dimmed slightly, entering quiet phases with fewer of the storms and spots that mark its stronger years, and the volcanoes spoke, great eruptions flinging veils of ash and haze high into the air, dimming the sunlight for years at a time, chilling whole continents from above. One colossal eruption in the 13th century, from a mountain called Somalis far away in the Indonesian islands, was among the largest in thousands of years, and its cold shadow reached all the way to the fields your ancestors tilled. Your quirky, humbling fact is that the frost biting your fingers tonight may trace part of its ancestry to a mountain exploding on the far side of a world you will never know exists. For you, of course, none of this comes with an explanation. You do not know about the sun's quiet phases or a volcano in the East Indies. You know only what your body and your fields tell you. That winter is a harder enemy than the songs remember. That the margin between a full barn and an empty one has grown terribly thin. That a single bad summer can now tip a whole village from getting by into genuine hunger. The Little Ice Age does not announce itself. It simply makes every winter a little more dangerous, every harvest a little more anxious, every cold night a little more likely to be the one that kills. The joke, a dark one, admittedly, is that you are living through a dramatic episode of climate change with absolutely no idea that you are, no name for it, no scientists to explain it, and no power on earth to do anything about it except pull your cloak tighter and pray for an early spring. You are a character in one of the great climate stories of human history, and from the inside it simply feels like life being hard, the way life has always been hard. The colder centuries left their mark in unforgettable images, some of which we have already met tonight. The Thames freezing solid again and again, the birds falling dead from the frozen air, and in the centuries just after your own, whole frost fairs held out on the ice of the river, with stalls and fires and crowds dancing where boats once sailed. The freezing of a great river became the age's emblem, the sign that the cold had truly come to stay. Historians still argue about the term itself, whether Little Ice Age is even the right name, whether it was one global event or a patchwork of regional cold snaps, whether it began at 1300 or later, and exactly how much of it was the sun and how much the volcanoes and how much the slow turning of the oceans. What no one argues about is that it was real, and that ordinary people felt it in the one place that mattered most, the harvest and the pot, and the thin cold line between surviving the winter and not. And nowhere was that line crossed more terribly than in the great catastrophe that opened the whole cold age, the years when the rains simply would not stop, and a continent began to starve. The cold did not only pinch the pot, in time it erased whole worlds. Those hopeful Norse settlers on Greenland, who had come in the warm centuries, watched their green pastures shorten and their sea lanes choke with drifting ice, until at last, after generations of struggle, their farms fell silent and the colony simply vanished from the pages of history. One of the first communities the new cold quietly killed. What happened to a distant island could happen, in smaller and slower ways, to a village, and in the years of the great rains it very nearly did. Let me tell you about the years the rain would not stop, because they are the shadow behind every anxious glance you throw at your woodpile and your larder. In the spring of the year 1315, just as your cold age was beginning, the rains came to Europe, and then they simply refused to leave. Through spring, through what should have been summer, through the autumn, the grey water fell and fell day after sodden day, across England, France, Germany, the whole of the north. The chroniclers, reaching for something vast enough to describe it, thought of Noah and his flood. For a farming world, endless rain is not an inconvenience. It is a slow catastrophe. The seed rotted in the waterlogged fields before it could sprout. The hay could not be dried, and so could not be stored. The grain that did grow stood pale and sodden and would not ripen, and what little was gathered was thin and poor and would not keep. The great engine of the countryside, plough, sow, grow, reap, store, jammed and failed all across a continent in the same terrible year, and when the harvest fails, the poor starve first. Grain prices climb to heights no one had ever seen, doubling and doubling again, until a loaf cost more than a labouring family could dream of earning. The stores from the last good year were eaten down to nothing. Then the next year, 1316, the rains came again, and the harvest failed again. And now it was not hardship, it was famine, real and widespread and pitiless, reaching from the cottages up into the halls of the not quite rich. People did what desperate people do. They ate the seed grain meant for next year's sowing, which fed them for a week and mortgaged their whole future. They foraged in the frozen woods for roots and bark and acorns, and things no one would eat in a good year. They walked to the towns and the monastery gates to beg for the charity of bread, and still, across northern Europe people died, of hunger and of the fevers and fluxes that prey on hungry bodies, in numbers that emptied villages and filled churchyards, a death toll that historians still reckon in the many hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, across the continent. Then came the cruelest turn. In the winter of 1317 into 18, on top of the hunger, the weather swung from drowning to freezing, and a savage cold came down. The animals that had survived the wet, starving years now froze in their byres and pastures, or fell to disease sweeping through the weakened herds. Thousands upon thousands of sheep and oxen dying, the very animals a recovering farm would need to climb back out of ruin. It was as if the weather, having flooded them, now wished to freeze whatever was left. Your quirky, grim little fact from these years is a small one that shows how everything connects. Even salt grew scarce. In much of the north, salt was made by letting sun and wind evaporate seawater, and in years of endless cloud and rain, The salt makers could not dry their brine. So just as families most needed salt to preserve what little food they could find, the salt itself failed, another quiet link snapping in the long chain that held survival together. I will not dwell on the worst of it, because this is a night for rest, not for horror, and the darkest stories of those years are not ones to carry into sleep. But I will tell you how people came through, because they did come through. They shared what little they had, neighbour with neighbour, in acts of quiet generosity that never made the chronicles. They leaned on the church, which fed the starving at its gates as best it could. They took in orphaned kin, doubled up households and pooled their dwindling stores. And above all, the survivors simply endured day by grey day, until at last, around the year 1322, the weather eased, the harvest returned, and the world slowly, unevenly began to fill its barns again. The joke here is too thin to really be one, so I will only say this. Every time a modern person romances the idea of eating seasonally and living off the land, they are describing, without knowing it, the exact conditions that in a bad year killed a good part of a continent. Your world does not romanticize the land. Your world knows precisely how quickly the land can turn from mother to executioner, and it never, ever forgets. Historians still argue over the true death toll of the Great Famine, and over how much of it to blame on the weather. How much on war, how much on a Europe that had simply grown too crowded in the warm centuries to survive one hard turn of the climate. What is not in doubt is that it was the first great blow of the Cold Age, a rehearsal in hunger for the even greater catastrophe of plague still a generation away, and it left, in the bones and the memory of your world, a permanent, watchful fear of the sky, a knowledge that survived in every peasant who ever looked up at gathering grey cloud and felt his stomach tighten. But the rain was one face of the Cold Age, the other was ice. So let us turn from the drowning years to the freezing ones, and to the winters so hard they froze a nation's greatest river solid. To your world, such a disaster was never only weather, it was read as judgment. When the rains would not stop and the grain would not grow, people looked not to the sky's hidden science, but to their own sins, and asked what the community had done to earn God's anger. Bishops ordered solemn processions. Barefoot penitents walked and prayed for the rain to cease, and the whole vast apparatus of medieval faith turned itself toward begging heaven for mercy. It is easy, from a warm and lettered future, to smile at this. But when you have no power at all over the thing that is killing you, prayer is not foolishness. It is the only lever left to pull. If the Great Famine was the Cold Age drowning the world, then its other signature was the Great Frost, the winter so fierce it turned running water to stone. And your world knew several of them, winters that the chroniclers set down with a kind of awe because they broke the ordinary rules of what cold could do. We touched one at the very start of our night. Let us return to it now, and to its terrible brothers, because these were the winters that truly tested whether all your clever survival, the fire, the byre, the wool, the huddle, was enough. Take the winter of 1407 into 1408. From December to March, month after relentless month, the snow fell and the cold deepened and would not break. The rivers froze. The Thames itself, the great tidal artery of England, locked solid enough that people walked and traded upon it. And the small birds, the finches and sparrows and thrushes of the hedgerows, died in their countless thousands, dropping frozen from the branches, undone by a cold too, deep and a world too buried in snow to feed them. When even the birds are falling dead from the trees, you know you are living through a winter that will be remembered. Barely 2 years later, in 1410, it came again. A great frost that gripped the land for 14 unbroken weeks, nearly a quarter of the year held rigid in ice, killing the wildfowl in the reeds and testing every larder and woodpile to its limit. And a generation on, in the winter of 1434 into 35, the Thames froze once more. From late in November all the way to St. Valentine's Day in February, so hard and so long that it blocked the river trade that fed and warmed the city of London. And again, a great multitude of birds is said to have died of the hunger and the cold. Your quirky fact, and a genuinely striking one, is the sheer tally of it. Across the centuries of the Cold Age, from the 1400s down to the early 1800s, the Thames at London is recorded as freezing over some 24 separate winters. Freezing a great river was not a once-in-history marvel in your world. It was a recurring feature of a Cold Age, common enough that the city half expected it and eventually turned it into a festival, though the famous frost fairs with their stalls and fires and printing presses set up on the ice belong mostly to the centuries just after your own. For a village like yours, a winter of that severity meant something very specific and very frightening, being cut off and running down. The snow closed the roads and the tracks, sealing each village into itself. For weeks at a time, no help coming in and no one going out. And in that sealed world, everything you had prepared was suddenly all you had, and it had to last. The woodpile you eyed so anxiously in autumn now shrank day by day toward nothing. The salted meat and the sanded roots dwindled, and the cold pressed on, past every reasonable expectation of when winter should ease, into that dreadful stretch where you begin, quietly, to do the arithmetic of whether your stores will outlast the frost. This is when all the small skills of your world became together, the difference between life and death. This is when banking the fire perfectly mattered, so that not one splinter of precious wood was wasted. This is when the cow in. The buyer earned her keep tenfold, her warmth helping hold the room above freezing when the fire had to be starved to make the fuel stretch. This is when the huddle of bodies, the piled wool, the heated stone, the rationed pottage, the barred door, all came together into a single stubborn machine for staying alive. None of it was heroic to look at. All of it, in a hard winter, was heroism of the realest kind. The gentle joke to carry out of these grim winters is this. Your entire civilization's response to being snowed in for 6 weeks was to gather everyone into one warm room, keep the fire low, eat carefully, tell stories and wait it out together, which is, more or less, exactly what a modern family does during a big snowstorm, minus the cow and plus a great deal of complaining about the internet. Some survival instincts, it turns out, never really change. Historians still argue over which of these winters was truly the worst, and even over how literally to take the old reports of the frozen Thames, pointing out that the medieval London Bridge, with its many close-set arches, dammed and slowed the river so much that it froze far more easily then than the free-flowing river ever would today. The freezing was real, but the old bridge helped it along. Still, argue as they might over the details, the shape of it is clear. Your world endured winters that would test the survival kit of any age, and it endured them with mud, timber, wool, fire, and each other. And it did not endure them alone, because your survival was never only a matter of your own four walls. It was woven into a whole community, and above that community sat the Lord. So let us climb the hill in the sleeping dark and see how the manor shaped the winter of the poor. There was, in a hard winter, one buffer larger than any peasant's larder, the great barns of the manor and the church. Into the tithe barn each year went 1/10 of the whole harvest, a tax paid in grain, and into the Lord's granaries went the rest of his due, vast timber halls of stored corn that dwarfed anything a cottage could ever hold. In the worst winters, whether that hoarded grain stayed locked away or was opened, sold, or given out to the starving could decide the fate of an entire village, which is exactly why, to understand how the poor survived the cold, you must first understand the man at the top of the hill who held the keys. So let's climb, in the sleeping dark, up the gentle slope to the manor and see how the other half of your world spends this same cold night. The Lord's Hall is a different country. It is larger, with a great central hearth heaped with a fire far bigger than yours, or in the grander houses an actual fireplace set into a wall. It has servants to feed that fire and to carry warmed spiced wine. It has more rooms, more light, more meat, thick tapestries hung on the walls to trap the heat, and beds with heavy curtains and feather mattresses. On this night, while you shiver pleasantly in your huddle of wool and family, the Lord sleeps warm in a way you will never know. That gap, that same frozen night experienced so differently a few hundred yards apart, is the basic fact of your world. But the manor is not only where the warmth is, it is the engine that shapes your entire life, because you do not simply own your land. You hold it from the Lord on terms, and those terms are the frame around everything, including how you survive the winter. In exchange for your strips in the great fields, you owe the Lord labour, so many days a week working his own land, his domain an extra boon days at the busy times of ploughing and harvest. You owe him rents, and you owe him a whole tangle of customary dues that reach right into your henhouse. Your quirky fact here is how wonderfully specific those dues could be. Rents and renders were often paid not only in coin but in kind, and in the depths of winter that could mean handing over hens at Christmas, or eggs at Easter, or a set measure of your grain. The calendar of your obligations mapped onto the calendar of the seasons. And there was a darker due still. In many manors, when a tenant died, the Lord claimed the family's best beast, the Heriot, as the price of passing the holding on. Even your death owed the Lord an ox. Between you and the Lord stands a small ladder of officials, and knowing them is knowing your world. The steward runs the Lord's affairs across all his manors. The bailiff manages this particular estate, and the reeve, chosen, remember, from among the peasants themselves, is the man on the ground who sees that the work gets done. The dues get paid, the strips get ploughed, he keeps the tallies, he answers for the village to the bailiff, and he is caught forever between his neighbours and his masters, trusted fully by neither. All of this is governed and enforced not by whip and dungeon mostly, but by the manor court, a regular gathering where the custom of the manor is remembered aloud, disputes are settled, and fines are handed down. And here is where your winter survival meets the Lord's law directly, because it was the manor court that policed the very rights that kept you warm and fed. The right to gather deadwood, to graze the common, to run your pigs in the Lord's woods in autumn, to cut peat from the moor, take more wood than custom allowed, cut a living tree, overgraze the common, and you would answer for it and pay for it at the court. Even your fuel came wrapped in rules. In theory, the bargain ran both ways. In return for your labour and your dues, the Lord owed you things too, protection in a dangerous world, justice through his court, and, in the hardest time, a measure of relief, for it was both his Christian duty and his plain, self-interest to keep his tenants alive, since dead peasants plough no fields and pay no rent. In a true famine, a good lord might open his granaries, forgive a rent, feed the starving at his gate. Whether any particular lord actually did so, or hoarded his grain, and watched the poor go hungry, was one of the great lotteries of a peasant's life. The gentle joke of it is that you spend your whole life working partly for a warm man, on a hill whom you may rarely even see, funding a comfort you will never share, and yet the whole arrangement is dressed up as a sacred web of mutual duty and ancient custom, which is to say, your world had already perfected the art of calling a deeply unequal deal a relationship several centuries before anyone thought to do it in an office. Historians still argue, and argue fiercely, about how to see this whole system, whether medieval serfdom was a kind of bondage close to slavery, a peasantry owned and exploited and tied to the soil, or whether it was something more tangled and more reciprocal, a hard bargain in which the poor had real customary rights, real protections, and more room to push back through the courts than the grim word serf suggests. The truth, as ever, sits somewhere in the difficult middle, and shifted from manor to manor and lord to lord. But whatever the balance of power, one thing is certain. No peasant survived the winter as an individual, you survived it as part of a whole, and the warmest part of that whole was not the lord on his hill at all, it was the neighbours all around you, in the tofts along the lane. So let's go back down and warm ourselves at the real fire of your world, the community. And once a year, the gap between hall and hovel narrowed, just a little. At Christmas it was the custom on many manors for the lord to feast his tenants, to throw open the hall, lay on bread and meat and ale, and let the very people who worked his land eat at his fire for a day. It was partly generosity and partly theatre, a yearly reminder of the bond that tied you to him. But on a dark December day, a belly full of the Lord's beef and a few warm hours in the great hall was no small thing, and the memory of it had to be carried a long cold way into the winter. Come back down the hill then, to where the true warmth of your world lives, not in the Lord's hall, but strung out along the lane in all those little smoking houses, each one holding a family that is, in 100 small ways, keeping yours alive. Because if there is one survival technology greater than the fire or the byre or the wool, it is this. You do not face the winter alone. You face it as a village, and the village is a machine for not dying, built out of nothing but neighbours. Watch how it works in the plainest things. Few peasants own a full plough team. A heavy plough needs many oxen, and you may have only 1 or 2, so you pool them, your beasts and your neighbours yoked together into one team. That works first this family's strips, then that one's, in a rotation as old as the fields themselves. Your quirky fact is that this humble act of sharing oxen, called co-aeration, was one of the quiet foundations of the whole open field world. The medieval village literally could not have fed itself if its families had not, of necessity, pooled the animals that pulled the plough. Cooperation was not a virtue here. It was infrastructure, and it ran through everything. You borrow a neighbour's tools and lend your own. You help raise a fallen roof or dig out a snowed-in door. When a family falls sick, others carry them food and firewood and take in their children. When a woman labours to give birth, the other women of the village gather to help her through it. There is no other safety net, no state, no insurance, no distant help. So the net is woven, thread by thread, out of the people within shouting distance, and everyone knows that the help they give in one bad week is the help they may beg in the next. At the centre of it all stands the church, and the church is far more than a place of prayer. It is the meeting house, the newsroom, the calendar, and the beating social heart of the parish. On Sundays and holy days the whole village gathers there, and before and after the service in the churchyard, the real business of community life is done. The gossip traded, the marriages arranged, the disputes aired, the news of the wider world passed hand to hand. In a world without newspapers, the church door is where you learn what is happening beyond your own frozen fields. And then there is ale, the warm, nourishing, mildly cheering centre of village sociability. Most ale was brewed at home, and mostly by women. A woman who brewed a good batch and sold the surplus was an alewife, and she might hang a bush or a broom above her door to signal that fresh ale was ready. The alehouse, or simply her front room, was where men and women gathered of a winter evening to drink and talk and warm themselves in company. Ale in your world is not merely drink. It is calories, it is safe liquid, it is warmth, and it is the social glue of the long dark season. For winter, though it starves the fields, is in its way the great social season of your world. The back-breaking work of the growing year eases. The days are too short and the ground too hard for much outdoor labour, and so people turn inward and toward each other. This is the season of firelight and storytelling, of songs sung and tales, told in long evenings of spinning and mending done in company. Neighbours gather in one another's houses to share a single fire and a single rushlight, and the warmth of many bodies and the winter night, which could be so lonely and so cruel, becomes instead the time of the richest human company in the whole year, and crowning it all are the great winter festivals, above all the 12 days of Christmas, a stretch of feasting and misrule and enforced merriment set defiantly in the very darkest, hungriest part of the year, as if your world had decided that the way to beat the midwinter was to light every candle it could afford and dance in the face of the dark. We will come to that in its own time tonight, because it deserves it. For now, simply know that your ancestors did not merely endure the winter grimly. They gathered and sang and drank warm ale, and told long stories by the fire and made of the cruelest season a time of deep togetherness. The joke, and it is a fond one, is that your entire social life in winter consists of crowding into a warm room with everyone you know to share food, drink, firelight, and gossip, which means the medieval village had already invented the house party, the potluck and the group chat, and ran all three on ale and wood smoke without a single wire between them. Historians still argue about how warm this village world truly was beneath its cooperation, whether the little community was a harmonious web of mutual aid, or a cramped and quarrelsome place where everyone knew everyone's business a little too well, and the same court rolls that record neighbours helping neighbours also bulge with their squabbles, slanders, and petty feuds. The honest answer, of course, is that it was both at once, exactly as any small tight-knit place is both. But quarrels and all, when the snow came down and the roads closed and the cold pressed in, the village held together because it had to, because holding together was the only way any of them would see the spring. And no members of that village needed its warmth more than the two groups we have not yet spoken of, the very young and the very old. Even bread could be a shared affair. In many places the village baked at a common oven, often the lord's for a small fee, since one well-built oven served a whole community far better and far more safely than a dozen. Little household fires, each risking a dozen little house blazes. The warmth, the fuel, and the fire risk were all pooled together, one more thread in the net. Now let's speak softly of the two who feel the cold most keenly, the very young and the very old, because how a village guarded them was the truest measure of how it survived. At the two ends of life, the body holds its heat poorly and spends its strength quickly, and the winter that merely tested a strong adult could genuinely threaten a baby or a bent old grandmother. So around these two, the whole warm machinery of the household quietly organised itself. Consider the infant first. A newborn in your world enters a winter that does not care about its fragility, and the family's answer is warmth, closeness, and constant care. The baby is swaddled, wrapped snug and firm in bands of cloth, partly to keep its limbs warm and still, partly from a belief that it would help them grow straight. Its cradle is set close by the fire in the warmest pool of the room, rocked and tended through the day, and at night it is kept near its mother's body, that oldest and most reliable furnace of all, sharing her heat through the dark. There was a danger in that closeness, and your world knew it and worried over it. A parent deep in exhausted sleep could, Roll onto a tiny child sharing the bed and smother it. The grief the old records call overlaying, and priests warned against it, and careful families used a cradle set beside the bed rather than risking the infant between them. Your quirky and rather touching fact is that this was a known, enough sorrow that it shaped custom and even church teaching, an entire society thinking carefully about how to keep its smallest members both warm and safe through the shared beds of a freezing night. Even so, winter took children. Infant and child mortality in your world was high, far higher than anything a modern parent could bear to imagine, and the cold months with their chills and fevers and thin food were the cruelest for the young. But I want to gently correct a myth here, because it matters. It is not true that medieval people, surrounded by so much loss, simply hardened their hearts and did not grieve. The records, the wills, the prayers, the heartbroken lines in chronicles and on tombs show parents who loved their children exactly as fiercely as parents always have, and mourned them exactly as deeply. High mortality did not make love cheap. If anything, it made every surviving child more precious. Now turn to the other end of the fire where the old ones sit. And here is a second myth to lay to rest. Your world was not one, where everyone dropped dead at 30. That grim little statistic is an average dragged down by all those infant deaths. A person who survived the dangerous early years had a very fair chance of living into their 50s, their 60s and beyond. Old people were not rare marvels in your village. They were a known and valued presence, and in winter they came into their own. For the old and the frail and the sick are given the warmest, most sheltered seat, the place closest to the fire, out of the draught, the throne of the hearth. And in return from that warm seat, they run the quiet indoor economy of the winter household. They mind the babies and the smallest children while the able-bodied work. They spin endlessly the wool that clothes the family. They mend and shell beans and watch the pot and tend the fire itself. The old and the young gather together in the warmest corner, keep one another, the grandmother too frail for the fields minding the grandchild too small for them, the two most vulnerable lives in the house guarding each other in the glow, and the old carry something else, something a village cannot survive without: memory. In a world where almost no one can read, the old people are the library. They hold the knowledge of which winter the great frost came and how the family got through it, of the remedy that eased a cough, the trick that saved a freezing lamb, the boundary of a field, the words of a prayer, the shape of a story. When they sit by the winter fire and tell the long tales through the dark evenings, they are not merely entertaining the children, they are downloading a lifetime of survival into the next generation, the only way their world has to pass it on. The gentle joke is that the warmest, best seat in the entire medieval house belonged by unquestioned right to the oldest person in it. A small, civilized custom that some modern families, squabbling over the good spot on the sofa, might do well to remember. Respect for the elders was not only kindness. By the fire in winter it was survival strategy dressed as good manners. Historians still argue over a famous and provocative theory which once held that medieval and early modern parents were so battered by child death that they held back their love, keeping their children at an emotional arm's length. But that bleak view has largely crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The grieving wills, the tender letters, the tiny carefully made graves. And most now agree that the people of your world loved their vulnerable young and honoured their frail old with all the fierce, ordinary tenderness of any human family facing a hard world together. And when that hard world made them ill, as the winter so often did, they turned to another keeper of old knowledge, the healer, the herb, and the prayer. So let us sit with the sick a while and see how your world fought the illnesses of the cold. A child, too, was never only its parents' concern. At its baptism it gained godparents, its gossips, as your world fondly calls them, sponsors who took on a real and lifelong duty of care, another set of adults formally bound to look out for it. In a world where a parent might not live to see a child grown, these extra bonds were no mere ceremony. They were a kind of insurance, woven in holy water and honoured by the whole community. Winter is the season of coughs, and your world knows the whole grim choir of them. The hacking chest, the streaming rheum, the shivering ague or fever, the aching joints that seize in the cold and damp, the chilblains blooming red on fingers and toes, these are the familiar ailments of the dark months, and nearly every household is nursing one or another of them by the deep of the season. Cold and damp and thin winter food and bodies, worn down by hard labour, make fertile ground for sickness, and your world has no true medicine to meet it. What it has instead is something older: herbcraft, custom, faith, and the accumulated wisdom of the wise. To understand how your world treats illness, you must first understand how it thinks illness works, because it is nothing like our picture of germs and infections. In the medieval mind, health is a balance of 4 humours in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, each tied to a pairing of hot or cold, wet or dry. Winter itself is cold and wet, and so winter illnesses are understood as the body growing too cold and too clogged with phlegm. The cure, logically, is to warm and to dry: hot drinks, warming spices, heating herbs, poultices, and getting the sluggish humours moving again. It is a whole elegant theory, entirely wrong about the mechanism, and yet it often pointed toward remedies that genuinely helped. The keeper of these remedies in a village like yours is most often a woman. The wise woman, the cunning woman, the local healer, whose knowledge of herbs and charms has been handed down through generations. She's your doctor, your pharmacist, and your midwife rolled into one, and she treats with what the fields and hedgerows in her own garden provide. For a bad cough she might reach for horehound or elecampane, bitter herbs still used against chest complaints. For pain and fever, she might turn to the bark of the willow. And here your world stumbles without knowing why onto real power, for willow bark contains the very substance from which we would one day make aspirin. Her honey soothes, and though she cannot know it, genuinely fights infection. Her warmed ale, steeped with herbs, comforts and warms. Not all of it worked, but more of it worked than a modern person might smugly assume. Woven all through the herbs are prayer and charm and saint, and to your world there is no clear line between them. A remedy might be a poultice, of herbs applied while a particular prayer is spoken over it a set number of times. A healing might call on a saint known for curing that very ailment. A charm might be written on a scrap and worn about the neck. To us this looks like superstition tangled up with medicine. To you it is all simply medicine, because you do not divide the body's healing from the soul's, or the power of the herb from the power of the prayer. Both are reaching for the same thing: help, from wherever help can be found. There is real medicine in your world too, if you can reach it. The monasteries keep infirmaries and physic gardens, growing healing herbs with care and copying out the old medical texts of the ancient world. Monks and a few learned physicians preserve and pass on a genuine body of knowledge, some of it Greek and Roman and Arab in origin, far older than your village. But such care is mostly for the monks themselves, the wealthy and the lucky. For you, the front line against a winter illness is the wise woman, the herb garden, the warm hearth, and the strength of your own worn body. Your quirky and honestly astonishing fact is this: modern scientists, growing curious about whether any of this old herbcraft really worked, once took a 1,000-year-old English remedy for an eye infection, a careful recipe of garlic, onion or leek, wine, and ox gall brewed in a brass vessel, and tested it in a laboratory against one of our most feared modern bacteria, the resistant staph infection called Maase. To their genuine surprise, the ancient brew killed it, again and again. Not every old remedy was a fairy tale. Some of them, it turns out, were the hard-won results of centuries of patient trial and error, and a few could stand toe-to-toe with the 21st century. The gentle joke, of course, is that the standard medieval prescription for a bad winter cold: get into bed, keep warm, drink something hot, rest, and wait, is very nearly word for word the advice a modern doctor will give you for the same cold today, several hundred years and one entire scientific revolution later. For the common run of winter ailments, it turns out, there was never much more to do than to keep warm and let the body heal. And your world, whatever else it lacked, understood keeping warm better than almost anything. Historians and scientists still argue, sometimes quite sharply, about how much of medieval medicine truly worked, how to sort the genuine pharmacology of the herbs from the placebo of the prayers, from the things that did nothing at all or active harm. That surprising massa-killing brew reopened the whole debate, and sent researchers combing back through the old remedy books to see what other, forgotten knowledge might be hiding in them. But for a peasant nursing a fever on a freezing night, the philosophy hardly mattered. What mattered was the warm bed, the herb-steeped ale, the murmured prayer, the care of the people around you, and the hope of living to see the light lengthen again. And light, and hope, and the turning of the dark towards spring is exactly what your world gathered up and made holy in the deepest part of winter. So let's turn now to faith, and to the long midwinter feast that carried your ancestors through the blackest nights of all. Here is the quiet genius of your world, and it is worth staying awake just a moment longer to admire it. at the very darkest, coldest, hungriest point of the whole year, the deep of midwinter, when the nights are longest and the stores are thinning and the spring is still an act of pure faith, your ancestors did not hunker down in grim silence. They threw the greatest feast of the year. They lit every light they could afford. They gathered and sang and celebrated defiantly in the teeth of the dark. If you want to know how people survived the coldest nights, this is a large part of the answer. They gave themselves something warm and bright to walk toward. The whole thing is built into the rhythm of the church, which rules your calendar as surely as the seasons do. First comes Advent, a stretch of waiting and light fasting, a drawing in and a preparing. And then at the solstice dark end of December comes Christmas. And not just a day, but the famous 12 days of it, running all the way from the Feast of the Nativity to Epiphany in early January. For those 12 days, as far as the hard world allows, work is set down, and feasting and rest and merriment take its place. It is the longest holiday of your year, planted deliberately in its darkest soil, at the heart of the home during. Those days burns the Yule log, a great log, sometimes hauled in with ceremony, set to burn slow across the 12 days, and often kindled with a saved, charred piece of last year's log to carry the luck and warmth of one winter into the next. Around it, the customs cluster thick, the house decked with evergreens, holly and ivy and bay, the green defiance of leaves that refuse to die in winter, the special foods hoarded and saved for these days, the games and the songs and the license to be merry. And there is wassailing, one of the warmest customs your world owns. Neighbours go from door to door through the cold with a great bowl of spiced warmed ale or cider, singing, offering a drink and a blessing of health for the year to come. In the orchard country they even go out to bless the apple trees, singing to them and pouring cider on their roots, to wake them toward a good harvest. Your quirky fact is that the very word carries the wish inside it. Wassail comes from an old greeting meaning be in good health, so that to wassail your neighbour was, quite literally, to drink to their surviving the year. The winter is studded, too, with the days of the saints, each a small fixed light in the dark. There is St. Nicholas early in December, the gift-giver. There is St. Lucy, whose very name means light, her day falling near the solstice like a promise. There is St. Stephen the day after Christmas, and a whole procession of holy days threading through the season, each one a reason to pause, to gather, to mark the passing of the dark with ritual and meaning. In a life this hard, the calendar of the saints is a kind of scaffolding for the soul, breaking the long, grey winter into a series of small bright waypoints, and running under all of it is faith itself, not as a grand theology, but as the daily, hourly texture of your life. You pray in the morning and at night and before you eat. You cross yourself against danger. You trust with a trust a modern person may struggle to imagine, that the suffering of this world is watched and weighed and will be answered, that the dark is not the end, that as surely as the Church promises the return of the light after the crucifixion, the spring will return after the winter. In the depths of a freezing, hungry night, that faith is not a luxury, it is load-bearing. It is part of how you do not despair. The gentle joke is that your ancestors, faced with the most depressing stretch of the entire year, looked at the long dark and the short rations and the biting cold, and collectively decided the correct response was a 2-week party with candles, singing, spiced booze, and as much feasting as they could possibly manage, which, honestly, is a survival strategy so psychologically sound that we still follow it, to the letter, every single December. Historians still argue, and with real relish, about how much of your midwinter feast is truly Christian, and how much of it is far older. The echoes of pre-Christian Yule and Roman midwinter revels, the evergreens and the great fires and the turning of the world upside down, surviving from deep pagan roots, and simply baptized into the Christian year. There was even, in the season's spirit of joyful misrule, the custom of raising up a boy or a commoner as a mock bishop or a lord of misrule, the low made high and the world merrily inverted for a day. Where the old ways end and the new begin is a knot scholars may never fully untie. But you do not care about the argument. You care that the hall is warm, the log is burning, the ale is spiced, the songs are old and known, and for a few bright days in the black heart of winter, your whole world has chosen joy. And yet, even in the season of feasting, the work of survival never fully stopped. So let us see what your hands were busy with through the winter, even here, even now. And the feasting was real feasting, all the sweeter for the fasting that framed it. The meat saved from the Martimas slaughter, the finest of the stored grain, The ale brewed strong for the occasion, the things hoarded and denied through the weeks of Advent were brought out at last, and for a few days even a poor table groaned a little. In a whole year of careful, counted hunger, those few days of plenty shone all the more brightly. Let me correct one last comfortable myth before the night turns toward dawn. The idea that your winter was a long idle sleep, the peasant dozing by the fire from harvest to spring. It is a lovely picture, and it is wrong. The field work eases, yes. You're not ploughing frozen iron, or reaping snow, but the work of your world never truly stops. It only moves indoors and into the barn and changes its shape. Survival is not only surviving the cold, it is doing all the patient labour all winter long that keeps the farm alive and ready for the spring. Chief among the winter jobs is threshing. All those sheaves of grain you gathered in at harvest are not yet food. The precious kernels are still locked in the ear, and they must be beaten free. So through the winter on the hard floor of the barn you thresh, swinging a flail, a jointed wooden tool, over and over hour after hour to knock the grain loose from the straw. Then you winnow, tossing the beaten grain in the moving air so the light chaff blows away and the heavy grain falls back clean. It is dull, rhythmic, endless work, done in the cold barn with your breath clouding, and it fills great stretches of the winter, because a family threshes its stored grain a little at a time all season long, grinding out its daily bread from the barn's slow hoard. The animals, too, need you every single day, and need you more in winter than at any other time. The beasts you kept alive rather than slaughtering must be fed from your dwindling store of hay, watered from troughs you must break the ice on each morning, and cleaned out and kept from sickness in their close winter quarters. And late in the cold season come the lambs, the ewes bearing in the bitter weeks of the year's end, so that the shepherd's hardest, coldest, most sleepless nights are spent out among them, saving the newborns from the frost. New life in your world arrives, cruelly, at the very hardest time to keep it warm. There is wood to cut and split and stack against the endless hunger of the fire. There are hedges to lay and ditches to clear in the dormant season. There are tools to mend, carts to repair, harness to stitch, buildings to patch before the next hard blow of weather finds the weakness. The winter is when a careful household catches up on all the making, and mending that the frantic growing season left no time for, a season of quiet, indoor, unglamorous repair. And then there is the work that quite literally never stops. The work of the women which runs like a thread through every hour of every day of the whole year. Cooking and childcare and the dairy and the brewing and the hauling of water, yes, but above all, spinning. The spinning of wool into thread was so constant, so unending, so much the default state of a woman's idle hands that a woman would spin while walking, while watching the children, while minding the pot, the spindle forever turning. Your quirky fact, and a lovely one, lives on in your own language. An unmarried woman was called a spinster because spinning was the work she was expected to do, and the female line of a family is still sometimes called the distaff side, after the very stick that held the wool she spun. All of this indoor and barnyard labour has its own rhythm, shaped by the short days. You rise in the dark, you work through the pinched grey daylight, and you stop when the light fails because you cannot afford to burn fuel to work by. The winter day is a small window, of grey light bracketed by long darkness, and into that window you pack the threshing and the feeding and the mending and the fetching, and then you retreat, again into the firelit dark. The pace is slower than the summer's brutal rush, but it is not rest. It is simply survival in a different, quieter key. The gentle joke is that the medieval peasant's famous winter off-season largely consisted of standing in a freezing barn beating grain with a stick, breaking ice for thirsty cattle at dawn, and spinning wool by hand until your fingers ached, which suggests that if your ancestors were taking a holiday, they had a truly punishing idea of what a holiday was. Historians still argue, interestingly, about how much genuine leisure a peasant actually had across the year. Some have claimed that with all the holy days and feast days and the slower winter pace, a medieval peasant may have worked fewer total days than a modern office worker, a claim that others have sharply disputed as far too rosy. The truth is tangled up in exactly how you count a working day, when the work is threshing in the morning, feasting at noon, and spinning by the fire at night. But whatever the final tally, your winter was no hibernation. It was a season of different work, done in the cold and the dark, quietly keeping the whole fragile enterprise of the farm alive until the ground softened and the great labour of the growing year began again. And now, at last, far off beyond the frozen fields, the sky is beginning, very faintly, to think about the dawn. Much of the year's cloth was made in these dark months as well. The spun thread went onto the loom, and the slow work of weaving turned it, inch by patient inch, into the very wool that clothed the family and warmed the winter bed. From the sheep's back to the spindle to the loom to the tunic on your shoulders, the whole long chain of making ran right through the cold season, in firelit rooms by hands that never seemed to fall still. The clothes that keep you warm tonight were, in a very real sense, winter's own quiet work. Come back now gently to your own sleeping body in the warm dark because the night is turning. Your second sleep, the one that took you after the quiet of the watch, has carried you down through the deepest hours, and now, slowly, it is beginning to thin. You're not awake, not yet, but somewhere far off a change is coming, the faint grey rumour of a morning that has not arrived. The longest, coldest part of your night's work is nearly done, and here is a cruel little truth of the natural world that your body knows without being told. The coldest hour of all is not the middle of the night, but the one just before the dawn. All through the long darkness the earth has been bleeding its warmth away into the clear black sky, and it goes on bleeding it right up until the sun climbs back over the horizon, so the temperature sinks and reaches its very lowest point in that pale, still hour when the first light is only a promise. Your ancestors did not have the science of it, but they had the feeling of it, deep in their bones, that the dark is always coldest right before it breaks. Look, if you could, at what the frost has done to your home overnight. On the coldest mornings, the cold does not merely wait outside, it reaches in. Frost forms on the inside of the shutters and the door, feathering the wood in delicate white ferns. The breath of the sleeping household hangs and freezes on the cold surfaces. The water left standing in a pail has grown a skin, or a solid lid, of ice. In an unheated room in the depth of a hard winter, the line between indoors and outdoors grows thin indeed, and you wake sometimes to a world that has quietly turned to glass and lace while you slept. But here is the triumph of your whole long night, the small quiet victory that everything depended on. Down in the ring of stones, beneath its grey blanket of ash, your fire is still alive. It did not go out. All through the freezing dark, banked and hidden and starved of air, it held on, a secret orange, heart of coals glowing low and patient, giving its gentle warmth to the room and asking nothing. Every skill of your world came together in that buried ember, the gathered fuel, the careful banking, the covered hearth, the whole art of keeping fire through a night without letting it either die or destroy you. And now, in the cold grey almost light, it is ready to be reborn. Somewhere outside a cock crows, ragged, insistent, absurdly loud in the frozen stillness, and it is the oldest alarm clock in the world. In a village without a single watch or clock, the roosters cry in the changing light, and the ringing of the church bell for the first prayers of the day are how you know the night is over and the morning has come. Your quirky fact is that for most of human history, this was the closest thing to a clock that most people ever had. The crow of the cock, the round of the bells, the height of the sun, and the slow wheel of the stars, a way of telling time that was accurate to the hour at best, and cared not at all for the minute, and so the household begins reluctantly to stir. Someone must be first, and it is very often the woman of the house, rising bravely out of the warm huddle into the biting air of the room while everyone else clings to the last of the shared heat. She goes to the hearth, and she performs the small daily resurrection that begins every winter day. She rakes back the ash, uncovers the glowing coals, lays on a little dry kindling, and bends close to breathe softly and steadily until the coals catch and a small new flame licks up into the cold morning. The fire is reborn from its own banked embers, and the house begins once more to warm. The gentle joke of the medieval morning is that the single bravest act of any winter day was simply being the first person to get out of the warm bed, a small unsung heroism performed daily in the freezing dark by whoever loved the others enough to go and wake the fire while they lingered in the warmth. Some forms of courage never make it into the songs, and this is one of them. Historians still argue over how medieval people truly experienced and measured time before clocks were common, how much the ringing of bells and the rhythm of prayers genuinely regulated the day, and how loose and local and approximate the whole sense of what hour it is really was for a peasant in the fields. The honest answer is that your world ran, not on minutes but on light and sound and season, on cock-crow and sunrise and the tolling bell, a softer and slower way of holding time that a modern person, ruled by the ticking clock, can scarcely imagine. But clock or no clock, the morning has come and you have survived the night. So let us rise at last into the cold bright day, and see the world you fought all night to wake up in. Far off, the church bell begins its morning round, calling the faithful to the first prayers of the day, its iron voice carrying clean and far across the frozen fields in the still air. The priest is already awake in the cold church, his breath clouding over the altar. And in the monasteries, the monks have been up for hours, having risen deep in the night to sing their offices in the dark. For while your world let the winter dark rule its sleep, the holy men broke it deliberately, keeping vigil through the coldest hours, so that someone, somewhere, was always awake and praying while the rest of the world slept. So rise, it is time. Push back the piled wool and the shared cloaks, and sit up into the sharp cold air of the morning room, your breath clouding in front of you, the new little fire beginning to crackle and throw its first warmth across the packed earth floor. Every part of you would rather stay in the warm hollow you have made, and every winter morning of your life you have gotten up anyway, because the animals must be fed and the day will not wait, and this simply is what it takes. The night is survived, the day has begun, that is not nothing. Some mornings, that is everything. The first task is water, and the first task fights back. The pail by the door has frozen over in the night, and you break the ice with your knuckles or a wooden spoon to get at the cold water beneath, or you go out to the well or the trough and break the ice there, gasping in the raw air. There is a splash of that icy water on the face and hands. The medieval alarm clock's second crueler ring, and then back to the fire, which is climbing now, growing, pushing the worst of the chill back into the corners of the room where it belongs. Breakfast, if you take one at all, is a humble and quiet thing, perhaps a hunk of yesterday's dark bread, perhaps a bowl of warmed pottage left from the night before, or a thin porridge of grain and water, frumenti if there is a little milk, and a touch of honey to make it kind, and ale, of course, small and mild, because it is safer and gentler than cold water, and it warms you from the inside. It is not a feast, it is fuel taken standing before the work, but it is warm, and it is yours, and after. A night like the one you have passed, a warm bowl held in two cold hands, is a genuine and simple joy. Then, at last, you open the door onto the morning, and oh, the world it reveals. The killing cold of the dark has become, in the low gold light of sunrise, something almost unbearably beautiful. The fields under a smooth blanket of untouched snow, the hedges furred white with frost, every twig outlined in silver, the low sun laying long blue shadows across the dazzling white. The smoke of your neighbours' fires rises straight and thin into a pale, clear, windless sky, each column a small announcement that another family too has made it through. The very thing that tried to kill you in the dark has become, in the light, a landscape of astonishing loveliness. Your world is cruel and beautiful in the very same breath, and you have learned to hold both at once. The village is waking around you. A door opens down the lane. A figure crosses to a byre, wrapped and hooded against the cold. Cattle low softly for their morning hay. The frozen day's work is beginning. The same work as yesterday and tomorrow. The feeding, the watering, the threshing in the cold barn, the endless spinning, the fetching and mending and minding that fills a winter day. You step out into it, your breath streaming, your feet crunching the bright snow. One more soul among millions across a frozen continent doing the plain, unglamorous, heroic work of staying alive. And that, when you strip everything else away, is the real story of how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. Not with any single clever trick, but with 1,000 small ones woven together. The thick thatch and the mud walls, the central fire and the buried embers, the cow in the byre and the family in the bed, the wool and the stone and the pottage and the prayer, the neighbours and the customs and the sheer stubborn patient endurance of ordinary people who had no choice but to be extraordinary at the business of not freezing to death. There was no magic, there was only skill and community and grit, repeated night after night after night, all the long winter through. The gentle joke, the one to carry with you towards sleep, is that these people whom history barely bothered to record, nameless, unlettered, buried in unmarked graves under the grass of places like Warren Percy, quietly pulled off, every single winter, a feat of survival that a modern person, stripped of central heating and hot water and the supermarket, would very likely not manage for a week. They were not simple. They were not backward. They were, in the one skill that mattered most in their world, absolute masters. And here is the last and truest fact of our whole long night, the one that ties you to them across all those centuries. Every one of us alive today is descended from people who survived nights exactly like this one. Somewhere back along your own line, however far, There were people who banked a fire and huddled close and broke the ice on the water, and got up in the freezing dark to feed the animals, and lived, because if even one of them had failed on even one cold night, you would not be here, warm, listening to my voice. Historians still argue over the details of their lives, and always will, but the plain warm miracle of it is beyond all argument. They made it through the dark over and over, so that one day you could lie safe and warm and drift towards sleep as you are drifting now. So let us bring our long night to its close. A neighbour lifts a hand to you across the white lane, a wordless greeting breathed out in a puff of frost, and it carries a whole unspoken sentence between you. You made it, and so did we. On the morning after the coldest night of the year, simply seeing another chimney quietly smoking is its own small kind of joy. We have travelled a whole night together, you and I, from the grey dusk over the frozen fields, through the smoky warm room and the banked fire and the shared bed, down into the first sleep and the quiet watch and the second sleep, and out again into the cold gold of a winter dawn. We have sat with the cow in the byre and the baby in the cradle and the old one by the hearth. We have watched the rain drown a continent and the frost still a river. And through all of it, one thing has quietly held. Ordinary people, with almost nothing, kept themselves and each other alive through the darkest and coldest that the world could send. I hope what stays with you is not the hardship but the warmth, because the more time you spend in that little house, the more you see that its story is not really one of misery at all. It is a story of ingenuity, of 100 small, clever, hard-won skills braided together into survival. It is a story of togetherness, of families and neighbours and whole villages leaning on one another because there was simply no other way. And it is a story of the deep human genius for finding comfort and meaning and even joy in the very heart of the dark, of lighting the Yule log and spicing the ale and telling the long tales, precisely when the night was longest and the cold was cruelest. And here is the thought I most want to leave with you, as the images of that old winter begin now to soften and fade. Those people were not so very different from you. They wanted the same simple things you want tonight, to be warm, to be safe, to be near the people they loved, to close their eyes at the end of a long day and rest without fear. The whole of their vast and patient effort, all that gathering and banking and huddling and enduring, was bent toward the very feeling you are wrapped in at this moment. They would have understood you perfectly, and you, having walked their night, understand them. So let the peasants slip away now. Let the mud walls and the byre and the frozen lane dissolve gently back into history where they rest. And come home to yourself, here, in your own bed, in your own warm and quiet room. Feel, just for a moment, the extraordinary luxury that surrounds you, a warmth that needs no gathering, no banking, no fear, a soft place to lie that no one had to stuff with straw, a door that keeps out the cold without a single log, water that will not be frozen in the morning. These are wonders your medieval ancestors could not have dreamed of, and tonight, quietly, they are simply yours. Historians still argue, and will go on arguing forever, about the fine details of those old lives, how cold, how hungry, how happy, how hard, and that is their work, and a good work it is. But you and I do not need the argument tonight. We need only the warmth they've handed down, across all those long dark centuries into this soft and peaceful moment that is yours to keep. If you take one single image from our whole long night, let it be the banked fire, that small orange heart glowing patiently beneath its blanket of grey ash, giving warmth without flame, holding on quietly through the coldest hours so that the morning would find it still alive. There is something in that image worth keeping. So much of survival then and now is not about the roaring blaze, but about the ember carefully kept, the warmth you protect and carry through the dark stretches, low and steady and hidden until the light comes back again. Your ancestors were masters of the banked fire in every sense. They knew, better than we do, how to keep something warm alive all the way through a very long night. And they knew, too, the thing our bright and busy world so easily forgets. That warmth is not really a matter of temperature at all, but of nearness, of bodies close together in the dark, of a whole family under one roof, of neighbours who would break the ice and share the pot and take in your children if the worst ever came. They were warm because they were together. On the coldest nights, that was the whole of the secret, and it is a secret worth carrying with you out of that little smoky house and into your own life, that no one in any century was ever really meant to face the cold alone. So there is nothing left to do now, nothing to gather, nothing to tend. The long night's work is done, and it was done well, and it was done for you, long ago by people whose names are lost and whose warmth remains. Let your eyes close now if they have not already. Let the last of the frost and the firelight blur softly together behind them. The fire is banked, the door is barred. The house is breathing slow around you, warm and safe and still. You have nowhere to go and nothing to carry and no cold to fear. Let your shoulders grow heavy, let your hands unfold. Let the day and the long-ago winter drift quietly away downstream. Outside, far off, the snow is falling without a sound and it cannot touch you here. You are warm, you're safe. You are held by every kind and stubborn soul who ever kept a fire through the dark so that you could one day rest like this. There is no bell to wake you now, no fire to tend, no ice to break, and no dark to fear. The night asks nothing of you at all, only this, to let go softly and to rest. Feel how heavy and how warm you have become, sinking a little deeper with every slow breath. Breathe in slow and soft, breathe out slower still, and let yourself sink gently down into the warm and waiting dark. Deeper now, and warmer, and further from the long-ago cold. Sleep now, you're safe, all is well, good night, sweet dreams.